It began in a place that history rarely pauses to explain. A small town caught between movement and resistance, where roads mattered more than buildings and timing mattered more than intention. Rochefort sat along routes that armies needed, but civilians never asked to host. Stone structures, narrow approaches, surrounding high ground. The kind of terrain that looks unremarkable until war arrives, and suddenly every slope, bridge, and intersection becomes a decision point. In the winter and early spring of the final year of the war in the West, Rochefort became one of those places where pressure collected quietly before exploding into violence. By the time fighting reached Rochefort, the rhythm of the war had already changed. This was no longer a campaign of sweeping advances and bold gambles. It was a war of exhaustion. A war of denial, a war of grinding movement measured in hours instead of miles. Armies were pushing forward not because victory felt glorious, but because stopping felt impossible. The land around Rochefort shaped everything. Roads narrowed as they entered the town, funneling vehicles into predictable paths. Hills and wooded areas limited visibility and concealed movement. Fields that looked open from a distance offered little cover once artillery began to fall. The town itself sat like a hinge, not large enough to dominate headlines, but positioned well enough to influence movement far beyond its borders. For advancing Allied forces, Rochefort represented progress. Another step forward in a war that was finally tilting their way, but still demanded constant effort. For German defenders, it represented delay. One more place where time could be bought, where resistance could be applied long enough to slow an advance that no longer needed to be stopped, only stretched. When the fighting began, it came without ceremony. Artillery fire cracked across surrounding ground, echoing through valleys and streets alike. Infantry moved cautiously, aware that resistance here would not be theatrical, but stubborn. Small units fought from buildings, tree lines, and road junctions, using terrain to force attackers to deploy, to slow, to fight instead of move. Rochefort became a place where nothing happened quickly. Every advance required coordination. Every withdrawal had to be covered. Every position lost had to be replaced by another just behind it. Tanks advanced carefully along roads that barely accommodated them, wary of ambush and mines. Infantry cleared ground step by step, house by house, ditch by ditch. Engineers worked under fire, repairing routes and clearing obstacles that seemed to multiply with every hour. The civilians who remained sheltered wherever they could, listening as walls shook and streets they had walked all their lives turned into channels of fire and smoke. The town absorbed the conflict unwillingly, like so many places before it, becoming part of a larger story it did not choose. German resistance around Rochefort was not about reclaiming ground, it was about friction. Friction that slowed columns, friction that disrupted schedules, friction that forced pauses where momentum wanted none. Each delay mattered, not because Rochefort was decisive on its own, but because the war at this stage was decided by accumulation, of fatigue, of supply problems, of pressure that never fully eased. As Allied forces pressed forward, resistance thinned unevenly. Some positions collapsed quickly, others held longer than expected. Fighting flared, faded, and flared again. Night brought little rest. Darkness hid movement, but amplified uncertainty. Flares lit the sky. Distant artillery rumbled constantly, reminding everyone that the front was never truly still. Eventually, the balance tipped. Pressure overcame position. Numbers overcame preparation. The defenders withdrew toward the next line, carrying their delay with them like a final contribution to a collapsing front. Rochefort fell not with dramatic collapse, but with quiet inevitability. Another place crossed. Another step forward taken at the cost of time, effort, and lives. The Battle of Rochefort matters because it represents how wars actually end, not with one final clean moment, but with dozens of smaller battles layered together, with towns taken because they must be taken, with resistance offered not because victory is possible, but because delay still has value. Rochefort was one of those places where history did not shout. It pressed forward steadily, grinding onward through terrain and people alike. Tonight, we return to that town and its roads, to the hills and narrow approaches, to the soldiers who fought without expectation of glory, only obligation. to Rochefort, where the war moved forward not with speed, but with persistence. Before we continue, let me bring you into this moment as well. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what time has settled around you there? Is it late and quiet, or is the day slowly winding down? And one final invitation, made only for this episode. If these long, steady journeys through lesser-known battles help you slow your thoughts, decompress, or feel grounded as the world grows quieter, consider subscribing, not out of habit, but so these calm, detailed histories are always here when you need something unhurried to listen to. Take a breath. This story moves slowly, just like the battle itself. September 2nd, 1944. Dawn breaks cold over the Belgian Ardennes, mist clinging to the valleys like a shroud. A German radio operator hunches over his equipment in a farmhouse outside Rochefort, his hands trembling as he transcribes the message coming through his headset. The words make no sense at first. American armor at Dinant, the bridges cut, all routes to the Meuse severed. He looks up at his lieutenant, a hollow-eyed veteran of the Eastern Front, and sees something he has never seen before in this man's face: raw, unfiltered fear. The pocket has formed, though neither of them understands yet what this means. In 12 days, 18,000 German soldiers will be dead, captured or broken in a battle that history will nearly forget. The trap did not spring suddenly. It closed with the patient inevitability of a noose being tightened by hands that do not rush, do not waver. For 3 days prior, German units of the 66th Corps had been conducting what their commanders euphemistically called strategic repositioning. In truth, a barely controlled retreat before the Allied advance following the breakout from Normandy. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, the legendary 116th Panzer Division, the 708th Infantry Division, these names once struck terror across Europe. Now they represented collections of exhausted men, broken equipment, and evaporating hope. They fell back through the Belgian countryside, believing they were executing an orderly withdrawal to prepared defensive positions along the Meuse River. Instead, they were walking into a killing zone from which thousands would never emerge. The fundamental miscalculation was this: they believed they were still fighting the war of 1940, when German armor moved like quicksilver, and Allied forces responded with plodding caution. But this was September 1944, and the Americans were no longer cautious. On the morning of September 1st, elements of the American 7th Armored Division executed a maneuver that military historians would later describe as either brilliant opportunism or reckless gambling, depending on their perspective. Racing north from their positions near Neuchâtel, American tank columns covered over 60 miles in 36 hours, their tracks chewing up the primitive Belgian roads, their crews subsisting on cigarettes and Benzedrine tablets. They reached the Meuse crossings at Dinant just as the last German supply columns were attempting to cross westward. The meeting was not a battle, it was a slaughter. American tank destroyers positioned on the high ground west of the river opened fire at ranges where the German truck drivers could not even see their attackers. Vehicles burned, bridges were seized, and in the span of 3 hours, the door slammed shut on 22,000 German soldiers still east of the river. The Americans had not planned an encirclement. They had simply driven fast and gotten lucky. But in war, luck and genius are often indistinguishable until long after the smoke clears. Inside what would become known as the Rochefort Pocket, a roughly oval area measuring 15 kilometers east to west and 20 kilometers north to south, the German reaction oscillated between denial and panic. Senior officers refused to believe the situation reports coming from forward reconnaissance units. How could the Americans have moved so quickly? Where was the Luftwaffe reconnaissance that should have warned them? The questions were futile, asked into a void that offered no answers. By the evening of September 2nd, when a lieutenant from the 708th Infantry Division finally convinced his regimental commander to climb the church tower in Rochefort and look westward with binoculars, the truth became unavoidable. American positions ringed the horizon like teeth. The mist that had concealed their movement was burning off under a climbing sun, and with it burned away the last illusions of escape. The lieutenant, whose diary would later be recovered by American intelligence officers, wrote a single sentence that night: We are in a bag, and someone is pulling the string. What these trapped soldiers could not have known, what even their commanders would not fully comprehend for another 48 hours, was that the order ensuring their doom had already been transmitted from Adolf Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. Hold at all costs. 3 words crackling across hundreds of miles of wire and radio waves, sealing the fate of an entire corps. Hitler's strategic philosophy, by late 1944, had calcified into a single, suicidal doctrine. No retreats, no tactical withdrawals, no elastic defense. Every meter of ground would be held until overrun. Every unit would fight in place until destroyed. His generals, veterans who understood that tactical flexibility was the only thing keeping the Wehrmacht functional against overwhelming Allied superiority, increasingly found their professional judgment overruled by a dictator whose connection to battlefield reality had snapped somewhere in the ruins of Stalingrad. The Rochefort pocket was not an accident of war. It was the inevitable result of a command structure where military expertise had been subordinated to ideological rigidity. The soldiers freezing in Belgian farmhouses that September morning were not warriors making a calculated stand. They were prisoners of a decision made by a man hundreds of miles away who viewed their lives as currency to be spent without regard for return. The Americans, for their part, did not immediately grasp the magnitude of what they had caught. Intelligence estimates on September 3rd placed German strength in the pocket at perhaps 5,000 to 6,000 troops, remnants of defeated units seeking to escape eastward. The reality was 3 times that number, including veteran formations that still retained significant combat capability despite weeks of continuous retreat. This miscalculation would cost American lives in the days to come, as hastily planned assaults ran headlong into prepared defensive positions, manned by desperate men with nothing to lose. But on that 3rd day of September, as American commanders studied maps and planned their next moves, the prevailing attitude was one of satisfied opportunism. They had bagged a significant German force, and while reducing the pocket would require some effort, the outcome was not in doubt. One American colonel, briefing his battalion commanders that afternoon, described the situation with characteristic bluntness. "We've got them in a barrel. Now we just have to nail the lid shut and decide whether to take them prisoner or bury them." The question was not if the pocket would fall, but how long it would take and what it would cost. The answers would surprise everyone. Inside Rochefort itself, a modest Belgian market town of perhaps 3,000 souls in peacetime, the civilian population faced a nightmare beyond anything in their lived experience. When German forces began fortifying the town on September 4th, the residents understood with sick certainty that their homes were about to become a battlefield. Families retreated to cellars and basements, dragging what food and water they could carry down stone steps worn smooth by centuries of use. The cellars of Rochefort, originally built as wine storage and later as shelter from the punishing Ardennes winters, now became lifeboats in a storm of steel and high explosive. Approximately 1,200 civilians, elderly couples, young mothers with infants, shopkeepers and farmers and school children, pressed into spaces designed for storing bottles and vegetables. They could hear the German soldiers above them, hammering, dragging furniture, smashing out windows to create firing ports. The sound of preparation is distinctive, metallic and purposeful, and it told the people huddled in the dark exactly what was coming. Some prayed, others simply held each other and waited for the world above to catch fire. The German defensive plan, hastily organized but executed with the professional competence that characterized even the Wehrmacht's twilight months, transformed Rochefort into a textbook example of strongpoint defense. Engineers identified 47 key positions, stone buildings with overlapping fields of fire, positions that could be mutually supporting, locations that would require frontal assault to reduce. Artillery crews rationing their remaining ammunition with miserly discipline, pre-registered coordinates for every approach road, every street intersection, every open square where American infantry might mass. Machine gun teams emplaced their weapons in interlocking patterns, ensuring that attacking forces would be caught in crossfires with no safe avenue of approach. The German military had been perfecting defensive doctrine since the nightmare of Verdun in the First World War. and that accumulated expertise showed in every detail of Rochefort's fortification. One American intelligence officer, examining the positions after the battle, would remark with grudging respect that the Germans had turned a small Belgian town into a fortress that Napoleon's engineers would have recognized and approved. As night fell on September 4th, the two armies settled into an uneasy equilibrium around the pocket's perimeter. American troops, exhausted from their rapid advance and increasingly aware that the pocket contained more Germans than initially believed, consolidated positions and awaited orders. German soldiers, knowing that relief was impossible and escape unlikely, checked their weapons and tried not to think about tomorrow. In the cellars of Rochefort, civilians listened to the sounds of boot heels on floorboards above them and wondered how many days they could survive on the food they had managed to bring below. The stage was set for a battle that would last 12 days, consume thousands of lives, and ultimately teach both sides brutal lessons about urban warfare in the age of total war. The mist that had concealed the pocket's formation was gone now, burned away by the afternoon sun. In the crystalline evening air, soldiers on both sides could see each other's positions with uncomfortable clarity. The waiting was almost over. The fundamental question facing both armies that evening was not military but temporal. How long could this situation persist before something broke? The Germans, trapped and undersupplied, were on a countdown to starvation and ammunition exhaustion. The Americans, operating at the end of a 600-mile supply line stretching back to the Normandy beaches, had their own logistics crisis brewing. Both sides were racing against time, against their own limitations, against the approaching autumn storms that would turn Belgian roads into rivers of mud. In Berlin, in London, in the farmhouses and cellars around Rochefort, men made calculations and placed bets on which army's endurance would fail first. The smart money, of course, was on the Americans. They had everything: air superiority, artillery superiority, infinite replacement capacity. But wars are not won by ledgers, and battles have a way of defying the tidy predictions of staff officers studying maps in heated rooms far from the fighting. Rochefort was about to become a laboratory for testing. What happens when professional competence meets overwhelming force? When ideology confronts reality? When exhausted men on both sides discover reserves of endurance they did not know they possessed? September 2nd had merely set the conditions. The battle itself was about to begin. August 25th, 1944. 20 miles behind what German maps optimistically still labeled the front, a makeshift workshop operates in the ruins of a barn near Bastogne. 3 Panzer Mark VI tanks, Tigers, the most feared armored vehicles in the Wehrmacht arsenal, sit motionless, their massive profiles casting long shadows in the late summer sun. But they are not resting. They are dead. Mechanics in grease-stained coveralls swarm over them like surgeons performing triage on wounded that cannot all be saved. The mathematics are brutal. 3 Tigers, 1 functional engine between them, enough spare parts to perhaps keep 1 vehicle operational for another week. The sergeant overseeing this mechanical cannibalization is 31 years old and looks 50. He has been performing variations of this same desperate surgery since Kursk, since the Eastern Front began its long collapse. Since the Panzer divisions stopped being instruments of blitzkrieg and became something sadder, collections of metal that consume themselves just to survive another day. This is the reality that historians would later struggle to convey. The legendary German panzers approaching Rochefort in early September 1944 were already ghosts. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich had begun the Normandy campaign in June with 169 tanks and assault guns. By the time its survivors limped into the area around Rochefort on September 1st, the division could muster 23 operational armored vehicles, a contraction of over 85% in less than 3 months. This was not primarily the result of combat losses, though those were severe enough. The killer was logistics. Each Tiger tank consumed 300 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers of travel, and fuel, by late summer 1944, had become more precious than ammunition. Panzer units across the Western Front were receiving between 20 and 30% of their required petroleum allocation, forcing impossible choices: move and starve, or stay in place and risk encirclement. The 116th Panzer Division, another formation caught in the Rochefort trap, had been reduced to calculating operational range the way a man dying of thirst calculates water remaining in his canteen, 12 kilometers. That was the distance their remaining Panthers could travel before exhausting their fuel supply. The grand armored sweeps that had conquered France in 1940, that had reached the outskirts of Moscow, that had made Panzer synonymous with terror across 2 continents, all of it had devolved into desperate arithmetic, performed by exhausted men trying to keep machines running on fumes and hope. The human dimension of this mechanical collapse was, if anything, even more devastating. The panzer force that approached Rochefort bore virtually no resemblance to the elite formation that had swept through the Low Countries 4 years earlier. The original cadre, veterans trained for years in combined arms tactics, men who understood armor warfare with the instinctive fluency of native speakers, had been consumed in Russia, in North Africa, in Normandy. Their replacements represented the scrapings of a barrel that had been scraped too many times before. The average panzer commander entering the Rochefort pocket in early September 1944 had received 6 weeks of training, 6 weeks to master a weapons system that pre-war doctrine suggested required 2 years of instruction to operate competently. They could drive the tanks, barely. They could load and fire the main guns, crudely, but the sophisticated tactics of fire and maneuver, of coordinated advance with infantry support, of using terrain and timing to maximize the panzer's considerable strengths while minimizing its vulnerabilities. These arts were being lost in real time, knowledge bleeding away faster than it could be transmitted to the next generation of doomed teenagers. The death ride toward Rochefort on September 1st encapsulated this tragic devolution in a single, terrible afternoon. A company of Panther tanks, 11 vehicles carrying 5 men each, 55 souls total, received orders to move north and establish defensive positions around the town. The distance to be covered was 28 kilometers, a journey that would have taken a trained panzer company perhaps 90 minutes in 1940. It took these Panthers 6 hours, and only 4 vehicles completed the journey. 3 broke down with mechanical failures, transmissions that had been cannibalized from other wrecks, engines run so far beyond their maintenance schedules that catastrophic failure was inevitable. 2 more simply exhausted their fuel en route, their crews forced to abandon them where they sputtered to a halt. Mute monuments to logistics failure, another was destroyed not by enemy action, but by driving off a road weakened by rain. The tank's 60-ton bulk crashing through a culvert and breaking the vehicle's back like a snapped spine. The final Panther struck a mine, probably British, possibly American, perhaps even German from some earlier defensive operation, and exploded with such violence that passing infantry refused to approach the wreck. 4 Panthers out of 11 reached Rochefort. Panzer warfare had become a suicide mission, where the enemy inflicting the most damage was entropy itself. Yet even in this state of advanced decay, the Panzer force remained dangerous in ways that would shock American commanders expecting easy victory. The Germans had learned terrible lessons on the Eastern Front, where they had faced Soviet armor in quantities that dwarfed anything in Western Europe. They had developed an almost pathological defensive competence, a bag of tricks accumulated from 3 years of fighting, outnumbered and undersupplied. At Rochefort, this expertise would manifest in ways that made a mockery of the vehicle count that American intelligence found so reassuring. A single dug-in Panther, hull down behind earthworks with only its turret exposed, could hold up an entire American tank company for hours. The German 75mm gun could penetrate any Sherman at ranges where the Sherman's gun was largely useless. An asymmetry that turned every engagement into a cruel gambling game where the Americans bet lives against time. The 23 operational tanks that the Germans managed to bring into the Rochefort pocket did not represent an offensive capability. They were defensive anchors, each one a lethal node that forced the Americans to either bypass, outflank, or pay the butcher's bill for frontal assault. The Panzer mystique, even in its twilight, still cast a shadow that shaped the battlefield. The ammunition situation added another layer to this Byzantine calculus of scarcity. Artillery shells, tank rounds, small arms ammunition, every category was rationed with a severity that would have been unthinkable in earlier years of the war. The German artillery supporting the Rochefort defense was limited to 5 rounds per gun per day in normal circumstances, a pittance compared to the thousands of shells that American batteries could expend without concern. But this force scarcity had bred innovation born of desperation. German gunners became artists of ammunition conservation, pre-registering every possible target, calculating their fire plans with the precision of watchmakers. When they did fire, every shell was accounted for, every target pre-selected for maximum effect. The Americans, by contrast, often employed the sledgehammer approach, massive bombardments that consumed ammunition by the truckload. Both methods had their merits, but the German approach, forced on them by circumstance, would repeatedly surprise American units who had assumed that supply shortages meant impotence. 5 shells per day, placed with malevolent accuracy, could break an infantry company as surely as 500 fired randomly into an area. The panzers were dying, yes, but they had learned to make their death throes count. Allied air superiority, overwhelming by any quantitative measure, completed the picture of German hopelessness, or so the statistics suggested. For every German aircraft that managed to fly over the Rochefort sector in early September, 20 American planes operated with virtual impunity. Fighter bombers roamed at will, devastating anything that moved on the roads. Strategic bombers pounded German rear areas, turning supply dumps and transportation hubs into moonscapes. The Luftwaffe, the force that had terrorized Europe from the skies in 1940, had been reduced to irrelevance in the West, its remaining strength husbanded for the defense of Germany proper. But air superiority, like tank superiority and artillery superiority, did not translate automatically into battlefield dominance. The Germans had become masters of concealment, movement by night, exploitation of weather that grounded Allied aircraft. They had learned that an army can still function, after a fashion, even when it has lost the skies, provided it accepts certain constraints and costs. The panzer crews approaching Rochefort had been trained, those who had received any training at all, to assume they would be fighting blind, deaf, and naked under hostile skies. It was their baseline condition, factored into every tactical calculation. This adaptation to catastrophic disadvantage would prove among their most valuable assets in the battle to come. The psychological impact of fighting with inadequate equipment, inadequate support, and inadequate hope cannot be overstated in understanding the German performance at Rochefort. These men knew they were fighting a lost war, not in some abstract strategic sense, but in the immediate tactical reality of every engagement. They knew that when their ammunition ran out, there would be no resupply. They knew that when their tanks broke down, there would be no spare parts. They knew that when they called for air support, the sky above them would remain empty of everything except enemy aircraft. And yet, they fought with a stubborn professionalism that bordered on the inexplicable. Part of this was training, the deep grooves worn into the psyche by years of German military indoctrination. Part was fear of Soviet revenge if the war ended in total defeat. Part, darkly, was the knowledge that surrender in 1944 carried its own risks and humiliations. But perhaps most significantly, it was the grim satisfaction of craftsmen who had become very, very good at a specific job, making the enemy pay for every meter of ground, and who took pride in that competence even as their broader cause dissolved into nightmare. The panzers rolling into Rochefort were corpses piloting other corpses, but they were dangerous corpses, and they would teach the Americans that overwhelming superiority on paper still had to be translated into fact through the messy, costly arithmetic of actual combat. By the time the pocket closed on September 2nd, the panzer component of the German defense at Rochefort represented the Wehrmacht's condition in microcosm. On paper, negligible, 24 operational tanks spread across a 15-kilometer perimeter, each one a maintenance crisis waiting to happen, each crew a collection of hastily trained replacements commanded by exhausted survivors. In reality, they remained the backbone of a defense that would hold for 12 days against an enemy possessing every advantage except the one thing that cannot be measured on logistics charts: the accumulation of hard-won expertise about how to die slowly and expensively. The Americans approaching the pocket in early September were about to receive an education in the difference between defeating an army and destroying it, between encircling an enemy and eliminating him. The lessons would be taught by ghosts driving machines held together with wire and prayers, by men who had forgotten what victory looked like, but still remembered how to make victory cost. The twilight of the Panzers was not a gentle sunset. It was a long, red fade into night. And it would illuminate the battlefield at Rochefort with a light born of fires that should have gone out months before, but somehow, impossibly, still burned. The final irony, visible only in retrospect, was that the Wehrmacht's material weakness at Rochefort would prove in certain ways to be a tactical advantage. Lacking fuel for mobile operations, they were forced into static defense, which played to their strengths. Lacking ammunition for probing attacks, they were forced to husband resources for decisive moments, which maximized effectiveness. Lacking air support, they were forced to move and fight in ways that exploited terrain and weather, which minimized Allied advantages. Deprivation had honed them into efficient instruments of defensive warfare in a way that abundance might never have achieved. This was not the Panzer Force that had conquered nations. It was something stranger and more desperate, an army that had learned to weaponize its own weakness, to make virtue of necessity, to transmute desperation into a kind of terrible competence. As American troops prepared their first assaults on the Rochefort pocket, they were about to discover that a dying enemy can be more dangerous than a confident one, because it has nothing left to lose and nowhere left to retreat. The Panzers were in their twilight, but twilight can last a long time, and the darkness that follows is absolute. August 30th, 1944, 10 o'clock in the evening. In a commandeered chateau near Nancy, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. stands over a map table, cigar clamped between his teeth, ivory-handled revolvers prominent on his hips. The map shows his Third Army's positions stretching across eastern France like a fan opening too wide, its elements dispersed across 200 miles of front. His logistics officer has just finished a presentation that can be summarized in 3 words. We are empty. Fuel reserves are at 27% of requirement. Ammunition stocks are adequate for perhaps 3 more days of heavy combat. The supply line from Normandy has stretched to its breaking point, with trucks consuming fuel just to deliver fuel. A vicious circle of diminishing returns. Every principle of military logistics says Patton should halt, consolidate, and wait for the supply situation to stabilize. Instead, Patton stubs out his cigar and issues an order that will create the Rochefort pocket and nearly destroy his reputation in the process. The 7th Armored will advance north at dawn, he says. They will not stop until they reach the Meuse. His staff exchanges glances. The decision is either genius or madness. In 4 days, it will appear to be both simultaneously. The gamble Patton proposed that evening was grounded in an understanding of warfare that separated him from more cautious commanders. He believed, correctly as events would prove, that the German army in France was in a state of near collapse, held together by organizational momentum and fear of consequences rather than genuine combat capability. Every intelligence report confirmed Wehrmacht units retreating eastward in disorder, abandoning equipment, surrendering in increasingly large groups. The window for exploiting this collapse was finite, measured in days or perhaps just hours. Once German forces reached the Rhine and its prepared defensive positions, once they had time to reorganize and resupply, the easy victory would evaporate, and the war would grind into the bloody slog that everyone feared. So Patton's calculus was this: gamble now, while the enemy is reeling, even if it means operating beyond sustainable logistics. Accept risk now to avoid greater risk later. His staff understood the logic, even as they questioned the wisdom. Wars are won by commanders who understand when to break the rules, but they are also lost by commanders who confuse recklessness with audacity. Patton was betting everything that he had correctly identified, which situation this was. The 7th Armored Division that received Patton's order in the pre-dawn hours of August 31st was a formation that embodied both the strengths and vulnerabilities of American mobile warfare in 1944. Its combat strength numbered approximately 10,000 men, equipped with over 200 tanks, armored cars, half-tracks, and supporting vehicles. In theory, it was a sledgehammer capable of smashing through German positions and exploiting deep into enemy territory. In practice, it was a logistical nightmare, a column that, When strung out on the road, extended for over 60 miles, consuming fuel and ammunition at rates that made supply officers wake up sweating in the night. The division's commander, Brigadier General Hasbrouck, received his orders with the grim recognition of a man being asked to perform a feat of questionable feasibility. He was to advance 120 miles through uncertain enemy territory, seize the Meuse River crossings, and cut off German forces retreating eastward. He would do this with fuel trucks that were themselves running on fumes, across roads that were little more than farm tracks, through a countryside that might contain nothing but stragglers, or might conceal intact German formations. When he briefed his subordinate commanders that night, he was brutally honest. "We're going to drive until we run out of gas or hit something that stops us. I don't know which will come first." The advance began at 0500 on August 31st, and for the first 36 hours, it proceeded with a dreamlike ease that made Patton's gamble look like prescience. The 7th Armored's reconnaissance elements, racing ahead of the main column, encountered scattered German units that melted away at the first sign of American armor. Roadblocks were either deserted or lightly held, swept aside with minimal fighting. Small French towns erupted in celebration as American tanks rolled through, their crews tossing rations and cigarettes to ecstatic civilians. The division covered 80 miles in the first day, a pace that would have been considered excellent in maneuvers, let alone actual combat. Radio messages to Patton's headquarters crackled with optimism. Light opposition, rapid progress, Germans in full retreat. But beneath this surface success, the operation's fundamental vulnerability was growing more acute with every mile. Fuel consumption was exceeding predictions. The supply column, struggling to keep pace, was falling further behind. By the evening of September 1st, lead elements of the 7th Armored were operating on less than 1/4 tank capacity. They had achieved Patton's objective. They had reached the Meuse. But they had done so at the absolute limit of their logistical tether, and they were about to discover that the Germans trapped behind them were far more numerous and dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The moment the trap snapped shut can be identified with unusual precision. September 1st, 1944, 14:30 hours. An American tank platoon from the 7th Armored's Reconnaissance Battalion reached the high ground overlooking Dinant on the Meuse's west bank and observed a scene of chaos on the roads to the east. German columns, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, even soldiers on foot were converging on the river from multiple directions, clearly attempting to cross before the American pincers could close. The tank platoon's lieutenant made a decision that exceeded his authority, but demonstrated the kind of battlefield initiative that wins wars. He ordered his tanks to open fire. At ranges exceeding 1,500 meters, American 75mm guns began dropping high explosive shells into the German columns. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Vehicles exploded, panicked horses bolted, soldiers scattered into the surrounding woods. Within minutes, the narrow road approaches to Dinant's bridges were blocked with burning wreckage, and the escape route was sealed. The lieutenant radioed back to division headquarters with a message that would enter American military history. "We're through. No opposition at the bridges. Germans stacked up on the east bank like firewood. Request permission to continue interdiction." Permission was enthusiastically granted. In the space of an afternoon, the opportunistic exploitation had transformed into something much larger, an encirclement that no one had actually planned. Patton's reaction to the news that his gamble had not only succeeded, but exceeded all expectations was characteristically exuberant and immediately complicated by the realization of what he had actually achieved. On one hand, the 7th Armored had cut off a significant German force. Initial estimates suggested at least a division's worth of troops, possibly more. This was exactly the kind of aggressive, exploitative warfare that Patton believed won campaigns. On the other hand, he had created a pocket that would now need to be reduced, which meant diverting forces and supplies to a siege operation when his entire operational concept was built around maintaining momentum. And he had done all of this while operating beyond his logistical means, meaning that his own forces were nearly immobilized by fuel shortages. The 7th Armored Division that had just closed the trap at Dinant was now itself trapped, not by enemy action, but by empty fuel tanks. When Patton's chief of staff pointed out this awkward reality, Patton's response was pure him. Then we'll reduce the pocket without moving. Tell Hasbrouck to sit there and kill every German who tries to get out. The order was easier given than executed. The immediate aftermath of the encirclement revealed the operation's precarious nature. American units that had raced north were now strung out across 60 miles of front, their positions marked more by fuel exhaustion than tactical planning. The 7th Armored occupied a thin line around the pocket's western edge, but the northern, eastern, and southern perimeters were barely screened by reconnaissance elements that could observe German positions, but lacked the strength to prevent breakout attempts. Infantry divisions that should have been following the armor to consolidate gains were still marching up on foot, days behind. Artillery was scattered along the line of advance, much of it out of ammunition, and all of it critically short of fuel to move into supporting positions. An aerial photograph taken on September 2nd shows the reality with uncomfortable clarity. A loose ring of American positions surrounding a pocket containing an unknown number of Germans, with gaps in the American line large enough to drive a tank battalion through. If the Germans had attempted an organized breakout in those first 48 hours, they likely would have succeeded. That they did not attempt it, that their command structure reacted with paralysis rather than urgency, was the lucky break that transformed Patton's gamble from potential disaster into eventual triumph. The supply crisis that Patton had accepted as the price of aggressive action now manifested with brutal clarity. The Red Ball Express, the truck convoy system that supplied Third Army, was performing logistical miracles just to keep fuel and ammunition flowing to the Normandy front, 300 miles from Rochefort. Extending that supply line another 60 miles to support operations at the Meuse was geometrically more difficult, not arithmetically. Every truck that drove to Rochefort consumed fuel that might otherwise have supplied combat operations elsewhere. Every ton of ammunition stockpiled for reducing the pocket was a ton not available for Patton's planned advance into Germany. Third Army's daily requirement was approximately 800,000 gallons of fuel and 20,000 tons of supplies. Actual delivery on September 3rd, the day after the pocket formed, was roughly 60% of requirement, and falling. Patton's other divisions were immobilized for lack of fuel. His artillery was rationing shells. His infantry was supplementing K rations with whatever they could scrounge from liberated French villages. The Third Army had achieved a spectacular tactical success and had simultaneously talked itself into a logistical crisis that threatened to paralyze the entire command. Senior staff officers began preparing careful memos to Patton, explaining why the attack on Rochefort should be delayed until the supply situation stabilized. Patton read the memos, then ordered the attack to proceed as planned. His reasoning was simple to the point of crude. Every day we wait, the Germans dig deeper. Kill them now. The fundamental tension at the heart of the Rochefort operation was now fully visible. Patton had created an opportunity through aggressive action that pushed beyond sustainable limits. The opportunity was real. Thousands of German soldiers were trapped and vulnerable. But exploiting that opportunity required resources that Patton did not have and could not quickly obtain. Proceeding with the attack risked American lives in an operation that might fail due to inadequate support. Delaying the attack risked allowing the Germans to organize their defense, making eventual victory more costly, and canceling the attack meant accepting that a spectacular operational success had been wasted, that the 7th Armored's dash to the Meuse had achieved nothing but the creation of a pocket that would then be abandoned. None of these options was good. Patton chose the least bad: attack now, accept the risks, bet that American firepower and determination could overcome supply deficiencies. It was the same calculation he had made on August 30th, just recapitulated under different circumstances. By this point, consistency demanded that he see it through. The jaws had closed. Now came the difficult part, making sure they stayed closed while the teeth did their work. The weather, that uncontrollable variable that shapes battles as surely as generals' decisions, provided one final complication. On September 3rd, the clear skies that had prevailed during the 7th Armored's advance gave way to heavy rain. The primitive Belgian roads, already damaged by the passage of armor, turned to glutinous mud that slowed supply trucks to a crawl. Air support. The American advantage that Patton had counted on to offset artillery shortages became intermittent and then ceased entirely as low clouds and rain made flying impossible. The mud was democratic in its effects. It hindered both American supply columns and any German attempts at maneuver, but it favored the defender, who needed only to stay in place while punishing the attacker, who needed to move men and materiel to the point of contact. Patton, watching rain stream down the windows of his command post, reportedly remarked that if he had known the weather forecast, he might have reconsidered the operation. But by September 3rd, reconsideration was a luxury no longer available. The gamble was all in, the dice were rolling, and all that remained was to see whether Patton's understanding of war's possibilities had been visionary or delusional. The answer would emerge from the streets of Rochefort, written in casualties on both sides, and measured in the 12 days it would take to reduce a pocket that Patton had assumed would fall in 3. The jaws had closed. Now came the grinding. September 4th, 1944. Morning. A German combat engineer stands in what was, 2 days ago, a prosperous Belgian bakery in central Rochefort. The ovens are cold, the proprietor and his family huddled in the cellar below. The engineer is measuring walls with professional detachment, calculating load-bearing capacity, identifying which interior partitions can be demolished to create fields of fire without compromising structural integrity. His notebook fills with sketches, gun positions, firing angles, overhead cover requirements, debris placement for street obstacles. This man is 38 years old, a construction foreman in civilian life, mobilized in 1939, and now possessed of 5 years' hard-earned expertise in the architecture of death. He has fortified positions in Poland, in France, across the endless reaches of Russia. He knows exactly how to transform a civilian building into a bunker that will consume American lives at a terrible exchange rate. Behind him, soldiers are smashing out windows, piling furniture against walls, filling the baker's flour sacks with earth for improvised sandbags. By nightfall, this building will be designated Strongpoint 17 in the German defensive plan. In 10 days, it will take American forces 6 hours and 40 casualties to capture it. The engineer doesn't know that yet, but he would not be surprised. He is very good at his job. The defensive system that took shape around Rochefort in early September 1944 represented the distilled wisdom of an army that had been learning how to defend against superior forces since Stalingrad. The fundamental concept was the hedgehog, a German military term for a strong point defense in depth, where key positions were fortified to be mutually supporting, creating interlocking fields of fire that forced attackers to expose themselves to devastating crossfire regardless of their avenue of approach. Unlike linear defenses, which could be breached at a single point and then rolled up, hedgehog defenses had no flanks to turn. Every strongpoint was an independent fortress that could continue fighting even if surrounded. The perimeter could contract under pressure without collapsing, each withdrawal falling back to prepared secondary positions. It was defensive warfare as practiced by a force that had long since abandoned the illusion of counter-offensive and had instead perfected the art of dying slowly and expensively. The German command at Rochefort had 48 hours to implement this system before the first American assaults. They made those hours count. 47 strongpoints were designated within Rochefort proper, a density of roughly 1 fortified position per 100 meters of urban front. Each strongpoint was typically a stone building, chosen for fields of fire and structural durability, garrisoned by a squad to a platoon, depending on the building's size. Thick-walled Belgian construction, built from local limestone to withstand Ardennes winters, proved excellent for military purposes. Walls that shrugged off winter storms also shrugged off rifle fire, and even some shell fire. The engineers' work transformed these inherent advantages into systematic lethality. Ground floors were sandbagged and loopholed for firing positions. Basements became ammunition storage and covered routes between buildings. Attics and upper floors, while vulnerable to artillery, provided observation positions. Furniture was piled against walls as supplementary protection and to channel American assaults into predetermined kill zones. Even the debris of demolition served a purpose. Knocked-down interior walls provided rubble that obscured enemy observation while creating improvised barricades. A building that had housed a Belgian family 72 hours earlier had become a machine for killing infantrymen, and every detail had been optimized for that purpose. The artillery supporting this defensive network was notable less for its quantity. The Germans had only 32 guns available within range of Rochefort, a pittance by the standards of 1944 firepower, than for the discipline with which it was employed. Normal doctrine called for artillery to fire barrages designed to suppress enemy movement and destroy positions. The Germans at Rochefort lacked the ammunition for such luxuries. Instead, they implemented a system of pre-registered fire that maximized the impact of their scarce shells. Every likely American approach route, every intersection where attacking forces might mass, every open area within the pocket had been surveyed and its coordinates recorded. Artillery observation posts maintained constant watch, and when American troops entered a pre-registered zone, a single radio call could bring down fire within 30 seconds. Accurate, concentrated, and devastating, precisely because it was so carefully rationed. German gunners were limited to 3 rounds per tube per hour in routine circumstances, but for these pre-planned fire missions, they could expend up to 8 rounds in a firestorm that caught attackers in the open and shredded them before they could seek cover. The Americans, accustomed to German artillery that fired sporadically due to supply shortages, would be repeatedly surprised by fire missions that demonstrated more about careful planning than abundant resources. The German machine gun employment at Rochefort elevated the MG-42 to the status of battlefield deity. This weapon, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute, twice the rate of American equivalents, had earned a reputation that transcended its technical specifications. The sound it made, a tearing cloth buzz that American troops called Hitler's zipper, was psychologically devastating before it ever hit a target. At Rochefort, German machine gunners implemented interlocking fire plans that ensured no approach to any strongpoint could be made without exposing infantry to fire from at least 2 guns simultaneously. The resulting crossfires were geometrically lethal. An American squad attempting to assault Strongpoint 12 found themselves under fire from guns in Strongpoints 11 and 14, positioned so that seeking cover from one meant exposure to the other. The only solution was to suppress or destroy all 3 positions more or less simultaneously, a task requiring coordination, heavy weapons, and time that American commanders often did not have or did not take. The machine gun positions themselves were expertly concealed and protected. Firing from within buildings through carefully prepared ports, the guns were nearly invisible until they opened fire, and even then their position was revealed only by muzzle flash and sound, both of which were difficult to pinpoint in the chaos of combat. The civilian population of Rochefort, approximately 1,200 souls trapped within this fortified zone, represented both a complication and a constraint for the German defense. International law forbade using civilians as shields or deliberately positioning military forces in ways that endangered non-combatants. But international law was a thin abstraction in September 1944, and the German command faced a brutal calculation. Ordering civilians to evacuate was both militarily idiotic. It would reveal defensive positions to observing Americans, and practically impossible given that the pocket was surrounded. Allowing civilians to remain meant they would inevitably be caught in the fighting, but it also meant that American artillery and air power would be constrained by the knowledge that every shell fired into Rochefort might kill Belgian families. The German solution was a compromise that satisfied neither humanitarian concerns nor military utility. Civilians were ordered into cellars and instructed to remain there. This kept them out of the way of military operations and provided them some protection from artillery. But it also meant that strong points were fortified directly above civilian shelters, raising the question, never formally addressed in orders but understood by all participants, of whether the German military was deliberately using civilian proximity to deter American fire. The answer, like most wartime moral questions, was complicated, ambiguous, and ultimately irrelevant to the men doing the fighting. The civilians were there, the Germans fortified around them. The Americans would have to decide how much Belgian blood was acceptable collateral damage for reducing German positions. The doctrine of elastic defense completed the German system at Rochefort. Unlike static defense, which held every meter of ground to the last man, elastic defense allowed for tactical withdrawals to secondary positions when a strong point became untenable. The concept was counterintuitive, but empirically effective. Let the Americans pay for every meter of advance, but don't sacrifice entire units defending positions that were about to be overrun anyway. A strong point under heavy attack would fight until its position became critical, usually indicated by Americans working around the flanks with explosives or the collapse of supporting positions, and then would withdraw through pre-planned covered routes to the next defensive line. This meant that American units who had spent hours and numerous casualties capturing a building might discover it empty. Its defenders already repositioned 200 meters deeper into the pocket and preparing to inflict the same bloody process all over again. For American commanders, this was maddening. Apparent victories turned into hollow gestures as the defense simply compressed rather than collapsed. The Germans could trade space for time, yielding the outer strong points first and falling back toward increasingly concentrated positions in Rochefort's center. The system worked only because the pocket was small enough that withdrawal distances were minimal and command and control remained intact. But within those constraints, it multiplied the defensive effectiveness of every strong point, because each position might be lost, but the garrison would survive to fight again. The final element that made Rochefort's defense so effective was the most intangible: the quality of the German soldiers implementing these tactics. The units trapped in the pocket represented a cross-section of Wehrmacht capability in late 1944, from recently mobilized replacements to Eastern Front veterans with years of combat experience. But even the newest soldiers had absorbed, through osmosis and brutal on-the-job training, the accumulated defensive expertise of an army that had been retreating under fire for 18 months. They knew instinctively not to fire until targets were close and certain. They understood the importance of conserving ammunition for critical moments. They had learned to identify the few seconds between American artillery lifting and American infantry advancing, the window, when defenders had to remount their positions and prepare to fire. Most critically, they had internalized the knowledge that they were going to lose, that the war was lost, that Germany was doomed, that fighting would change nothing, and they had made peace with fighting anyway. This was not the fanaticism of true believers or the desperation of men with hope for victory. This was something colder and more dangerous, the professionalism of men performing a job they knew to be pointless but refusing to perform it poorly. They would dig their positions properly because that was doctrine. They would maintain their weapons because that was training. They would kill Americans efficiently because that was their function. The fact that it all meant nothing in the strategic scheme did not enter into their calculations. This mentality, duty divorced from purpose, would prove among the Germans' most potent weapons at Rochefort. The Americans approaching this defensive system in early September were, for the most part, unaware of what awaited them. Intelligence estimates focused on German weakness in numbers and supplies, both of which were real enough. But they missed the crucial variable. Competence compounded by desperation can multiply force effectiveness in ways that bean-counting logistics cannot predict. The first American assaults on Rochefort would proceed on the assumption that German resistance would crumble quickly once pressure was applied. This assumption was not unreasonable. It had been validated repeatedly over the previous months as Wehrmacht units throughout France had collapsed when confronted with American firepower. But Rochefort was different. The pocket was small enough that German command and control remained functional. The supply situation, while terrible, was not yet catastrophic, and most importantly, the Germans had nowhere to retreat to. They could not trade space for time beyond the confines of the pocket. This removed the option that had saved countless German units throughout the summer of 1944, the ability to disengage and withdraw before being destroyed. At Rochefort, disengagement meant capture. Withdrawal meant nothing except moving deeper into a shrinking perimeter. The only choice was to fight in place, and the Germans had prepared to fight in place with every lesson learned from 3 years of defensive warfare on the Eastern Front. The hedgehog was ready. Now, it was waiting for the Americans to thrust their hands into its spines. September 6, 1944. An American artillery battery, positioned 3 kilometers west of Rochefort, receives a fire mission request from infantry attempting to reduce a German strongpoint. The request is detailed and urgent. 12 rounds high, explosive, specific coordinates, danger close to friendly forces. The battery commander checks his ammunition status and finds he has enough shells. Then he checks his daily allotment, the number of rounds headquarters has authorized him to expend. He has already reached 70% of his daily limit, and it's only 1,400 hours. He radios back to the infantry with a message that will be repeated, with variations, dozens of times across the Rochefort front over the coming days. Request denied, insufficient ammunition priority allocation. The infantry company commander receiving this message experiences a moment of cognitive dissonance so profound it borders on surreal. He is fighting for the largest military power in human history, a nation that produces more steel, more explosives, more of everything than any country has ever produced, and he is being told that 12 artillery shells exceed his authorized consumption. 3 of his men will die in the next hour, deaths that those 12 shells might have prevented. The supply paradox of Rochefort has claimed its first unnecessary casualties. The fundamental absurdity of the Rochefort supply situation was that both sides were simultaneously starving and drowning in abundance, depending on which metric you examined and what time scale you considered. The Germans were objectively destitute, reduced to 1,000 calories per day per man, rationing ammunition so severely that some infantry squads had fewer than 10 rifle rounds per soldier, dependent on horses for transport because they had no fuel for vehicles. Yet this scarcity had produced a kind of lethal efficiency, where every bullet was accounted for and every shell was placed with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The Americans were objectively wealthy. Behind them stretched the industrial might of the arsenal of democracy, supply ships crossing the Atlantic in continuous convoys, factories producing war materiel at rates that exceeded the consumption of combat by comfortable margins. Yet this abundance stopped at Normandy, unable to flow forward faster than the primitive logistics infrastructure could carry it. The result was the strange spectacle of American divisions in eastern France reduced to near immobility, while supply dumps in Normandy overflowed with materiel that could not be transported to where it was needed. Both armies were fighting in a state of deprivation. The difference was that the Germans had adapted to it while the Americans were still learning. The Red Ball Express, that celebrated truck convoy system that kept Patton's Third Army supplied during its race across France, represented both logistics triumph and the limits of the triumph. At peak operation, the Express moved over 12,000 tons of supplies daily, utilizing 5,000 trucks, driving one-way loops along designated routes from the Normandy beaches to forward supply dumps. It was a magnificent improvisation, a testament to American organizational capacity and the willingness of truck drivers, many of them African-American soldiers in segregated units, to work themselves to exhaustion, keeping the combat forces supplied. But the mathematics were unforgiving. Every mile the front advanced eastward added to the length of the supply route, and fuel consumption increased geometrically rather than linearly. A truck driving from Cherbourg to Patton's positions near Nancy consumed nearly 100 gallons of fuel for the round trip. That same truck could carry perhaps 5 tons of cargo, of which 2 tons would typically be fuel. The arithmetic was stark. 40% of the fuel delivered was consumed just getting the fuel forward. As distances increased, this ratio worsened. By early September, with some Third Army units nearly 400 miles from the Normandy ports, the supply system was approaching a breaking point where trucks would consume more fuel, transporting fuel, than they could actually deliver. The specific situation at Rochefort took this general crisis and concentrated it to microscopic intensity. The 7th Armored Division and supporting infantry units investing the pocket required, at minimum, 700 tons of supplies daily: fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare parts, all the materiel necessary to sustain 11,000 men and several hundred vehicles in combat operations. Actual delivery averaged 340 tons per day during the first week of the battle, less than half of requirement. This shortfall meant rationing, and rationing meant prioritization. And prioritization meant that commanders had to make choices about which types of combat would receive support and which would not. Artillery was rationed because shells were heavy and transportation was limited. A single truckload might carry only 15 tons of 105mm ammunition, enough for perhaps 4 hours of intensive fire at a single battery. Fuel was rationed because every gallon consumed moving units within the combat zone was a gallon not available for future operations. Even food was rationed. K rations were supplemented by whatever French and Belgian civilians could provide, a reversal of the normal pattern where American abundance fed liberated populations. The soldiers fighting to reduce Rochefort were doing so on partial resources, fighting a battle that their nation's industrial capacity should have made easy, but which logistics had rendered difficult. The German supply situation was worse in every absolute measure, but paradoxically more stable because it had already hit bottom and could fall no further. On September 5th, the daily ration for German soldiers in the Rochefort pocket was 400 calories, roughly equivalent to a single meal at an American field kitchen. This was supplemented by whatever could be scavenged: vegetables from Belgian gardens, meat from horses killed by artillery fire or deliberately slaughtered to prevent starvation. Water was available from town wells, but dysentery began spreading through German positions by the second week, further degrading combat effectiveness. Ammunition status was even more critical. German units in the pocket had begun the battle with perhaps 60% of authorized small arms ammunition and 40% of artillery ammunition. By September 6th, these numbers had fallen to 30% and 25%, respectively. German company commanders were instructing their men not to fire unless targets were certain and close, a discipline that actually enhanced defensive effectiveness by preventing the wild, suppressive fire that characterized many American attacks, but that could not be sustained indefinitely. The Germans were consuming their supplies like a candle burning down, and everyone knew that when the candle went out, the fighting would end not through defeat, but through simple inability to continue. The surreal symmetry of both sides' supply crises produced bizarre tactical situations that would have been darkly comic if they had not been measured in lives. On September 7th, an American infantry company reached positions close enough to a German strongpoint to consider an assault, but lacked the explosives necessary to breach the building's walls. At the same moment, the German garrison in that strongpoint had exhausted its ammunition for the MG-42. That was the position's primary weapon. Both sides maintained their positions in a stalemate dictated not by enemy action, but by absence of materiel. An American battalion commander, radioing back to request resupply of mortar ammunition, was informed that no trucks were available for delivery until the following day, because all available transport was being used to move fuel forward. The fuel being moved forward would not arrive in time to support his attack the next morning, meaning the attack would be delayed, meaning more days of combat, meaning more supplies consumed, meaning more delays. The whole system had become circular, feeding on itself, a Mobius strip of logistics where every solution created new problems that required more solutions. German attempts to resupply the pocket from outside demonstrated both creativity and futility. On September 8th, 4 Junkers 52 transport aircraft attempted a supply drop, flying low over the pocket at dusk in hopes of evading American fighters. The mission was a catastrophe. One aircraft was shot down by American anti-aircraft fire, crashing in flames east of Rochefort with no survivors. 2 more jettisoned their cargo prematurely when intercepted by American fighters, the supply containers falling into no man's land, where neither side could safely recover them. The 4th aircraft successfully dropped its cargo within German lines, approximately 2 tons of ammunition, medical supplies, and food. This represented less than 1% of the pocket's daily requirement, delivered at the cost of an aircraft and crew. Further air resupply attempts were abandoned as militarily pointless. The Germans in the pocket were isolated in the most complete sense. No resupply was possible, no evacuation of wounded was feasible, no reinforcement could arrive. They would fight with what they had, and when they had nothing, they would stop fighting. The timeline was simply a question of arithmetic. The psychological impact of fighting under severe supply constraints affected both armies differently but significantly. American troops, accustomed to overwhelming material superiority, found the rationing deeply unsettling. They had been trained to employ firepower as the solution to tactical problems, call in artillery, call in air support, suppress the enemy with superior volumes of fire. Now they were being forced to fight in ways that resembled the infantry combat of earlier wars: close assaults with rifle and grenade, careful fire discipline, acceptance of casualties that more abundant firepower might have prevented. This was not the war they had been promised, and the disconnect between expectation and reality generated frustration that bordered on cynicism. German troops, by contrast, had been fighting in resource-constrained conditions for so long that Rochefort felt less like a crisis and more like the continuation of their normal existence. They had learned to expect nothing, to improvise everything, to view supply as a pleasant surprise rather than a guaranteed entitlement. This made them psychologically more resilient to deprivation, but also more fatalistic. They knew how this ended. The final paradox of Rochefort's supply situation was that it probably prolonged the battle rather than shortening it. Had the Americans possessed unlimited artillery ammunition and fuel in the first week of fighting, they likely could have simply buried the German positions under shelling until nothing survived to resist. Had the Germans possessed adequate supplies, they might have been able to mount the kind of coordinated counterattacks that could have bought time or even achieved local successes. Instead, both sides fought a constrained battle, neither able to employ their optimal tactics, both forced into a grinding, small-unit combat that favored the defender and maximized casualties on both sides. The siege of Rochefort became a battle of attrition, not because either side chose that strategy, but because neither side had the resources to fight any other way. In the calculus of war, this meant that the battle would be decided by which army could endure longer, materially, psychologically, organizationally. The mathematics suggested the Americans would prevail, but mathematics had to be translated into reality through the medium of combat, and that translation would prove expensive beyond what any logistical forecast had predicted. The supply paradox of Rochefort meant that the battle would be won, not by the side with more resources, but by the side that could make its scarce resources count for the most. In early September, that contest was still undecided. September 5th, 1944. 6 o'clock in the morning, E Company, 38th Infantry Regiment, stands in an assembly area 1,500 meters south of Rochefort, waiting for the order to advance. 122 men organized into 3 rifle platoons and a weapons platoon, led by a captain who has been in France for 6 weeks and in command for 9 days. The men are tired but not yet exhausted, nervous but not yet terrified, uncertain but not yet broken. Most of them are replacements, drafted civilians who completed basic training and then were shipped directly to Europe to fill the holes torn in veteran units by the summer's fighting. Their average age is 21. 60% of them have never been in combat. They are about to assault prepared German positions defended by men who have been killing people professionally for years. The company commander, looking at his watch and then at the town ahead, understands with sudden clarity that a significant percentage of the men standing behind him will be casualties before sunset. He does not know which ones, neither do they. At 06:15, the order comes over the radio. Advance. E Company moves forward into a battle that will teach the American Army brutal lessons about urban combat, lessons that will be written in the blood of young men who had been working in factories and going to high school just months before. The initial artillery preparation was supposed to neutralize German defenses and allow infantry to advance under a protective barrage. It accomplished neither. American gunners, rationed to 20 rounds per tube for the entire day's operations, laid down a 10-minute bombardment that was impressive in its noise and largely irrelevant in its effects. Shells fell on Rochefort's stone buildings, creating dramatic explosions and substantial clouds of smoke and dust. But the structures themselves, thick-walled Belgian construction built to last centuries, shrugged off anything except direct hits. The German defenders, sheltering in basements during the bombardment, emerged when it lifted to find their positions largely intact, and Americans advancing across open ground. The fundamental mismatch was this: American doctrine assumed artillery would suppress or destroy defenders, allowing infantry to advance and consolidate gains. German defenders, having survived far worse bombardments on the Eastern Front, understood that artillery was a nuisance to be endured rather than a threat that necessitated surrender. When E Company's lead platoon reached the southern edge of Rochefort at 0645, they discovered that every assumption underlying their attack had been wrong. The Germans were not suppressed, the positions were not destroyed, and the defenders were very much ready to fight. The killing began at a range of 70 meters, close enough that the American soldiers could see the window slits from which the machine gun fire originated, but too far to effectively suppress those positions with rifle fire. The sound of an MG-42 is distinctive, a buzzsaw rasp that tears the air at a rate of fire so high that individual shots blur into a continuous roar. E Company's first squad walked into interlocking fire from 3 German positions, fire that had been pre-planned and rehearsed, fire that converged on the narrow street down which the Americans were advancing and turned it into a slaughter chute. 8 men went down in the first 5 seconds, killed or wounded so quickly that most of them never had time to seek cover. The survivors did what training taught them. They hit the ground. They tried to identify targets. They returned fire at positions they could barely see. But returning fire with rifles against machine guns firing from protected positions is not a fair exchange. It is a trade where one side has all the advantages and the other side has only courage, and courage is a currency that depletes quickly under fire. By 0700 hours, 15 minutes after first contact, E Company's lead platoon had suffered 40% casualties and had advanced exactly 0 meters. The tactical problem facing E Company and American units all across the Rochefort perimeter was centuries old. How does attacking infantry close with prepared defenders who possess superior fields of fire? The traditional solution is combined arms. Use tanks to provide mobile firepower, use artillery to suppress defenders, use smoke to conceal movement. Coordinate all these elements to overwhelm the enemy's ability to respond. E Company attempted this. They radioed for tank support, and were told tanks could not navigate the narrow streets and debris-filled approaches to Rochefort. They requested artillery smoke and were told smoke shells were not available in sufficient quantities. They called for direct artillery fire on the German positions and were told their target grid was danger close to civilian dwellings and required higher-level authorization that would take hours to obtain. Left with no good options, the company commander chose the least bad: small unit infiltration, using fire and movement at the squad level to work around the German strongpoints rather than through them. This was tactically sound in theory. In practice, it required a level of unit cohesion, leadership at the squad level, and tactical expertise that replacement-heavy American infantry units in September 1944 simply did not possess. Squads became disorganized. Platoons lost communication with each other. The attack dissolved into disconnected clusters of men trying to find cover while under continuous fire from positions they could not effectively engage. By mid-morning of September 5th, E Company had advanced roughly 400 meters, 4 city blocks, at the cost of 47 casualties, 12 dead, 35 wounded. The survivors were physically exhausted from carrying wounded back to aid stations, psychologically shattered by the sudden violence and the death of men they had been joking with hours earlier, and organizationally degraded to the point where the company could barely function as a cohesive unit. Similar scenes were playing out across the American assault frontage. B Company, attacking from the east, suffered 38 casualties in the first 2 hours and gained 200 meters. A company, providing support by fire, expended 60% of its ammunition in 3 hours without observably affecting German defensive capability. The attack that commanders had estimated would secure Rochefort by nightfall had, by noon, ground to a halt with American forces holding positions at the town's edge and the German defense entirely intact. Worse, the Germans demonstrated they were not content to simply defend. At 1500 hours, a German counterattack, small in scale but precisely executed, hit a company's exposed flank, drove them back 300 meters, and reclaimed ground that had cost 8 American lives to take that morning. The counterattack lasted 20 minutes and inflicted 15 additional casualties before the Germans withdrew to their original positions. It was a demonstration calculated and cold. We can hit you whenever we choose, and there is nothing you can do to prevent it. The second day, September 6th, began with American commanders attempting to correct the mistakes of the first. More artillery was allocated to support the assault, still inadequate, but better than the previous day. Infantry companies reorganized, redistributing ammunition and personnel to replace losses. Tank destroyers were brought forward to provide direct fire support. Their guns used to blast German strongpoints from ranges where the defenders could not effectively return fire. The attack resumed at 0800 hours with renewed determination and marginally improved tactics. The results were marginally less catastrophic, but still fell far short of success. American infantry, now approaching German positions with more caution and better use of cover, reduced their casualty rates but also slowed their advance. Buildings that looked empty from the outside proved to be occupied by Germans who had observed the American approach, allowed them to close, and then opened fire at point-blank range. One platoon entering what they believed was a cleared building found themselves in a close-quarters fight with German soldiers using the interior as a fortified maze. A battle that lasted 40 minutes and ended with the Americans retreating and the building remaining in German hands. The problem was not American courage or even American tactics in isolation. It was that the Germans had turned an entire town into a three-dimensional killing field where every approach was covered, every building was a fortress, and every apparent weakness was a trap. The third day, September 7th, brought no significant improvement in American fortunes, and the dawning realization among American commanders that reducing Rochefort was going to require a fundamental change in approach. The cumulative casualties from 3 days of fighting had exceeded 250, roughly the equivalent of an entire infantry battalion, and the gains were minimal. American forces held positions in Rochefort's outer periphery, but had not penetrated to the town center or secured any of the key strongpoints that anchored the German defense. Battalion and regimental commanders conducted hasty after-action reviews, trying to identify lessons from the failures. What emerged was a clear pattern. Frontal assaults against prepared positions resulted in prohibitive casualties. Infiltration tactics worked better, but required more time and created coordination problems. Tank infantry cooperation was essential, but difficult to execute in tight urban terrain. Artillery was useful, but only if available in sufficient quantities and employed with precision. These were not revolutionary insights. They were principles that the U.S. Army had known since training manuals were first written, but knowing principles and executing them under combat conditions proved to be vastly different things. The psychological toll of the first 3 days fighting was as significant as the physical casualties. American soldiers began exhibiting the symptoms of combat fatigue, tremors, inability to sleep, hypervigilance alternating with numbness. The endless stress of urban combat, where death could come from any window or basement, where no position felt safe, where the enemy was invisible until the instant he killed you, wore down even veteran soldiers. For the replacements who constituted most of the assault units, the shock was profound. They had been told that German forces were defeated, disorganized, ready to surrender. Instead, they had encountered an enemy who fought with cold professionalism, who gave no quarter, who made every meter cost blood. The disconnect between expectation and reality generated a sense of betrayal, irrational but deeply felt. They had been lied to about what this battle would be like. Squad leaders reported men hesitating before entering buildings, freezing under fire, finding excuses to avoid point positions. This was not cowardice in the traditional sense. These men were still fighting, still following orders, but it was the erosion of the aggressive spirit that successful assaults require. An attacking force that has been bled white for 3 days without significant success does not attack on the 4th day with the same confidence it brought to the first. The Germans, observing from their strong points, could see the change in American tactics, more cautious, more hesitant, more inclined to call for support rather than press forward. They interpreted this correctly as evidence that the American will to attack was weakening. They were wrong about the ultimate outcome. The Americans would eventually win. But they were right about the immediate situation. The easy victory had evaporated, and what remained was going to be a slow, brutal grind. The after-action reports filed by American commanders on the evening of September 7th made for grim reading. The 38th Infantry Regiment reported 227 casualties, 27 killed, 188 wounded, 12 missing, in 3 days of fighting. Ground gained, approximately 800 meters average penetration into Rochefort's defensive zone. Buildings secured, 11 of the estimated 47 German strongpoints. Estimated time to complete reduction of pocket at current rate, 12 to 15 more days. Estimated additional casualties, 600 to 800. These numbers were unacceptable but unavoidable given the tactical situation. The regiment could not sustain casualties at this rate without being rendered combat ineffective, but halting the attack would allow the Germans to strengthen their remaining positions, and would mean that the casualties already suffered had been wasted. The only option was to change tactics, to learn from the bloody education of the first 3 days, and develop an approach that reduced casualties while maintaining offensive pressure. The question was whether the American army could adapt quickly enough, whether the institutional learning could occur in days rather than the weeks or months that such fundamental tactical evolution typically required. The Germans had spent years learning to defend. The Americans had 72 hours to learn to attack. The collision between German expertise and American adaptability would determine how much longer Rochefort would hold, and how many more men would die for its stone streets and shell-pocked buildings. September 8, 1944. 2,200 hours. In a battalion command post established in a farmhouse half a mile from Rochefort, a 24-year-old lieutenant named Thomas Brennan sits at a salvage kitchen table covered with hand-drawn maps and diagrams. He has been in France for 8 weeks, in command of a rifle platoon for 3 weeks, and in combat for 3 days. In those 3 days, he has lost 17 men from his 40-man platoon, nearly half his strength. He has also learned more about urban warfare than any classroom at Fort Benning could have taught him. The diagrams on his table represent an innovation born of desperation, a new assault formation that combines riflemen, automatic weapons, demolition charges, and careful timing in ways that differ fundamentally from the doctrine he learned in training. Tomorrow morning, he will brief his surviving men on these tactics. If they work, men will live who would otherwise die. If they fail, more names will join the casualty lists. But doing nothing, continuing to attack the way they attacked on September 5th, is guaranteed failure. The American army is learning. The brutal way armies always learn in war, through trial and error, where error is measured in body bags. The fundamental lesson emerging from the first 3 days of fighting was that frontal assault against prepared urban defenses was not merely costly, it was futile. American infantry advancing down streets toward German strongpoints were silhouetted targets engaging concealed enemies, a geometry that favored defense so overwhelmingly that no amount of courage could overcome it. Lieutenant Brennan's innovation, developed in consultation with his platoon sergeants and informed by hard experience, inverted this geometry. Instead of advancing down streets, his squads would move through buildings, blasting or climbing through interior walls to bypass German fields of fire. Instead of trying to suppress German positions with rifle fire, an impossibility given the Germans' protected firing ports, he would use white phosphorus grenades to create smoke that blinded defenders while assault teams closed to grenade range. Instead of attacking in daylight when German observation was optimal, he would emphasize dawn and dusk attacks, exploiting the liminal light when visibility was poor and German gunners struggled to acquire targets. These were not revolutionary concepts. Urban warfare had been employing similar tactics since Stalingrad, but they were revolutionary for this American battalion, and they represented a fundamental shift from the rigid by-the-book approaches that had failed so bloodily in the previous days. The innovation spread laterally through the battalion, as officers compared notes and survivors shared what had worked and what had gotten men killed. A captain in B Company developed a variation on Brennan's tactics, the blowtorch and corkscrew approach, borrowed from Marine Corps fighting in the Pacific. Infantry would isolate a German strongpoint, sealing it off from mutual support by other positions. Then combat engineers would move forward, protected by intense suppressive fire and smoke, and use satchel charges or flamethrowers to attack the building directly. The demolition would either kill the defenders, force them to evacuate, or create breaches through which infantry could enter and clear the building room by room. The approach was resource-intensive, requiring engineers who were in short supply and explosives that were being rationed. But it worked. A strong point that had held out for 2 days against conventional assault fell in 45 minutes to blowtorch and corkscrew tactics. Word spread. Other companies began requesting engineer attachments. The demand for explosives increased from 20 pounds per day to 200 pounds per day. Supply officers scrambled to meet the requirement, pulling engineers from other sectors and diverting explosive stocks from planned operations elsewhere. The tactical evolution was creating its own logistics crisis, but it was a crisis born of success rather than failure. The Germans, professional soldiers attuned to shifts in enemy tactics, observed these American innovations with concern and grudging respect. After-action conversations among German officers, recorded in unit diaries and post-war interrogations, reveal their awareness that the Americans were adapting. One German company commander noted that American attacks on September 8th were noticeably more competent than those of September 5th, with better use of smoke, more careful approach techniques, and more effective employment of supporting weapons. The German response was to adapt their own tactics. Strongpoints that had been defending in place began implementing more aggressive patrol activity at night, sending small teams to probe American positions, gather intelligence, and disrupt preparations for the next day's attacks. Defensive positions were adjusted to account for American use of smoke, with alternate firing positions prepared so that defenders could shift if their primary positions were obscured. The Germans also began implementing a more ruthless version of elastic defense, abandoning outer strong points earlier in the engagement rather than fighting to the last man, preserving veteran troops to strengthen the inner defensive ring. The battle was becoming a tactical duel, each side refining techniques in response to the other's innovations, the whole engagement taking on the character of a grim laboratory where theories were tested in blood. The emergence of specialized assault teams represented the most significant organizational innovation to come out of Rochefort's early fighting. By September 9th, American units had largely abandoned the standard rifle platoon organization, 3 squads of 12 men each, plus a weapons squad, in favor of ad hoc assault teams tailored for urban fighting. A typical team consisted of 6 men, 2 riflemen to provide security, 2 Browning automatic rifle gunners to deliver suppressive fire, 1 bazooka operator to engage hardened positions, and 1 combat engineer with demolition charges. These teams were smaller than regulation squads, but they were more flexible and more lethal in close combat. They could move quickly, had enough firepower to suppress most defensive positions, and could breach walls or doors when needed. The organizational innovation required commanders to mix personnel from different units, riflemen from one company, engineers from another, bar gunners from a third, creating temporary formations that violated military bureaucracy but worked in combat. Sergeant records became nightmares of confusion as men were temporarily attached and detached from their parent units. But the teams were effective, and effectiveness trumped administrative cleanliness. Communication improvements during this period were less dramatic than tactical innovations, but equally important. The early assaults had suffered from chronic coordination problems. Infantry couldn't talk to tanks. Platoons lost contact with company headquarters. Artillery fire missions took 20 minutes from request to delivery. By September 9th, these problems were being systematically addressed. Field telephones were run forward to frontline positions, allowing near-instantaneous communication with supporting artillery. Radio procedures were simplified, cutting out unnecessary authentication protocols that wasted time in combat. Forward observers were pushed closer to the fighting, sometimes accompanying assault teams directly, so they could call fire missions from positions where they could actually see the targets. The improvement in artillery response time was dramatic, from an average of 20 minutes on September 5th to 4 minutes on September 9th. This meant that American infantry under fire could receive supporting fire before they were overrun, a seemingly obvious capability that had been absent in the early fighting, but that now gave attackers a critical edge. The Germans, whose artillery remained rationed and limited, could not match this responsive fire support, giving Americans a significant advantage in any sustained engagement. The human dimension of tactical evolution was as significant as the technical and organizational changes. The men fighting to reduce Rochefort on September 9th were not the same men, psychologically, who had begun the assault on September 5th. They had been hardened by loss, educated by survival, and transformed from civilians in uniform into something more closely resembling actual soldiers. They moved differently, more carefully, using cover instinctively rather than as a conscious decision. They fired differently, short, aimed bursts rather than wild spraying of bullets. They thought differently, always looking for covered routes, always identifying potential German positions, always maintaining awareness of exits and fallback positions. This expertise was being purchased at terrible cost, but it was real expertise nonetheless. Squad leaders who had survived the first day's fighting possessed knowledge that could not be taught in training. How to read a building's windows to guess where defenders might be positioned, how to time movements to exploit the moments when German observation was degraded, how to coordinate assault teams without elaborate planning, simply through accumulated experience of working together under fire. The veterans, and after 4 days, anyone who survived qualified as a veteran, were becoming a precious resource. Their tactical knowledge critical to mission success. The casualty rates reflected the impact of tactical evolution. September 5th had cost the 38th Infantry Regiment 85 casualties. September 6th cost 73. September 7th cost 69. September 8th cost 52. September 9th cost 41. The trend was clear and encouraging. American forces were learning to fight more effectively with fewer losses, but the absolute numbers remained grim. Over 320 casualties in 5 days for a single regiment, losses that approached the point where the unit's combat effectiveness would be compromised. And while casualty rates were declining, the rate of advance remained frustratingly slow. Improved tactics reduced deaths, but did not dramatically accelerate progress. German strongpoints still had to be reduced one at a time, each requiring hours of fighting, each defended by men who had no intention of surrendering until physically unable to continue fighting. The tactical evolution was saving American lives, which was its primary purpose, but it was not shortening the battle, which meant that the cumulative cost continued to mount even as daily costs declined. By the evening of September 9th, the American approach to reducing Rochefort had crystallized into a system that bore little resemblance to the assaults of 5 days earlier. Attacks were launched at dawn or dusk rather than mid-morning. Assault teams, rather than full platoons, conducted the actual fighting. Engineers accompanied every attack, bringing explosives to breach walls and doors. Artillery fire was pre-registered on likely German positions, with forward observers positioned to call fire within minutes. Smoke was used liberally to conceal movement. Infantry moved through buildings rather than down streets wherever possible. Tanks and tank destroyers provided direct fire support from positions where they could engage German strongpoints without exposing themselves to German anti-tank weapons. The cumulative effect of these changes was to transform urban assault from a blunt instrument, mass and courage overwhelming defense, into something more resembling surgery, precise, systematic, methodical. It was still bloody work, and men still died, but the dying was achieving results in a way that the early assaults had not. The Germans, observing the American tactical evolution and recognizing that their own defensive capability was eroding, began planning for what came next. Ammunition stocks, carefully rationed, had fallen to critical levels by September 9th. Food supplies were exhausted except for what could be scavenged. Medical supplies were nearly gone, with wounded receiving only the most basic treatment before being moved to cellars, where they could do nothing but wait and hope. The German command at Rochefort faced a calculation that was becoming increasingly urgent. At what point does continued defense transition from military necessity to pointless sacrifice? The Americans were learning, adapting, becoming more effective with each passing day. The Germans were depleting, degrading, losing combat power through attrition and supply exhaustion. The trajectory was clear. The only question was how long the trajectory would take to reach its inevitable conclusion, and how many men would die in the interval. German officers began conducting quiet conversations about surrender, not as formal planning, but as private acknowledgement of reality. These conversations were dangerous. Defeatism could be punished by execution even in September 1944, but they were also unavoidable. The men defending Rochefort were not fools. They could see the situation as clearly as their commanders. The tactical evolution they were observing in American attacks was not just evidence of enemy learning. It was a preview of their own defeat, approaching day by day, yard by yard, casualty by casualty. The American learning curve was steep. The German survival curve was steeper. September 9th, 1944, 1400 hours. In a cellar beneath what was once Rochefort's town pharmacy, a German field surgeon operates by the light of 2 kerosene lanterns. The patient on the improvised operating table, a door laid across sawhorses, is a 19-year-old private with shrapnel wounds to the abdomen. The surgeon has no anesthetic except a quarter syringe of morphine that he administers knowing it is inadequate for abdominal surgery. He has no antibiotics, no blood for transfusion, no surgical instruments beyond what he carried in his medical kit, and what he has improvised from hardware scavenged from destroyed buildings. The pharmacy's stock of medical supplies was exhausted 3 days ago. Now he works with what he has, which is essentially his hands and his knowledge and a syringe of morphine that he has already diluted to extend its usefulness. The young soldier on the table is conscious, biting down on a leather belt to keep from screaming. The surgeon knows the boy will likely die of infection even if the surgery succeeds, because without antibiotics, abdominal wounds in these conditions are nearly always fatal. But he operates anyway because the alternative is to do nothing, and doing nothing is not a choice he can accept. Around him in the cellar, 43 other wounded men wait their turn or wait to die, and the surgeon cannot tell which category most of them occupy. This is what remains of the German medical system in the Rochefort pocket on day 8 of the siege. Improvisation, desperation, and the knowledge that doing your best is often not enough. The collapse of logistics inside the pocket had progressed with the inevitability of a timer counting down. The initial supply situation, inadequate but sustainable for a few days, had degraded into something approaching medieval siege conditions. Food was the most immediate crisis. By September 8th, the daily ration had fallen to 400 calories per man. A thin soup made from vegetables scavenged from Belgian gardens, supplemented by meat from horses that were being systematically slaughtered. The horses represented a bitter irony. They had been kept alive as transport animals, in an army that had run out of fuel, but now they served as emergency rations for men who had run out of food. German soldiers, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front, who thought they had experienced every deprivation warfare could offer, discovered new dimensions of hunger. One lieutenant, keeping a journal that would later be recovered, described the sensation with unsettling precision. It is not the sharp hunger of missing a meal, but a constant gnawing emptiness that makes thought difficult and motion painful. Men are weaker every day, moving slowly, thinking slowly, the whole pocket grinding down like a clock with no one to wind it. Water, paradoxically, was more available than food, which created its own problems. Rochefort's town wells still functioned, providing drinkable water for both German soldiers and trapped civilians. But without adequate food, without proper sanitation facilities, the town's sewage system had been damaged by shelling. Water became a vector for disease. Dysentery appeared in German positions on September 7th. By September 9th, it was endemic, a medical crisis layered atop the existing medical crisis of combat casualties. Men too weak from hunger to fight effectively became weaker still from dysentery, a vicious spiral of degradation. The German command implemented water discipline, attempting to ensure that drinking water was boiled before consumption. But this required fuel that was itself in short supply. Soldiers faced a choice between drinking unboiled water and risking disease or following proper procedure and consuming scarce firewood. Most thus chose the water. Most got sick. The pocket was defeating itself through biology as much as through American firepower. Ammunition scarcity had transformed German defensive tactics in ways both subtle and profound. Infantry squads defending strongpoints were instructed not to fire unless targets were certain and within 100 meters, a restriction that saved ammunition but ceded the initiative to American forces. Machine guns, the backbone of German defensive firepower, were rationed to 30-round bursts rather than the continuous fire that doctrine prescribed. Artillery, already severely limited, fell nearly silent after September 8th, except for pre-planned fire missions supporting critical defensive positions. The Germans were conserving ammunition the way a drowning man conserves air, rationing breaths, knowing that when the air runs out, the struggle ends. This created a strange acoustic environment within the pocket. Long periods of near silence interrupted by brief, savage exchanges of fire when American assault teams reached contact distance. American soldiers, accustomed to German positions that blazed away whenever targets appeared, found the silence unnerving. It felt like the quiet before a trap springs, and often it was exactly that. German defenders allowing Americans to approach, conserving ammunition, waiting for the range to close before opening fire with devastating effect. The social structure within the pocket was fracturing under pressure in ways that revealed the Wehrmacht's internal contradictions. Regular army units, the Wehrmacht proper, were pragmatic about their situation, following orders but increasingly open to discussions about when continued resistance became pointless. Waffen-SS units, ideologically committed and bound by oaths that made surrender psychologically difficult, maintained a harder line, insisting that the pocket would hold until relief arrived. No one believed relief was coming, but the SS troops maintained the fiction with a fervor that regular troops found alternately inspiring and insane. Tensions between these groups, usually suppressed by military discipline, began surfacing. On September 8th, an SS officer executed a Wehrmacht lieutenant for defeatist statements. Apparently, the lieutenant had suggested that the pocket might consider surrender if casualties reached certain thresholds. The execution was technically legal under the draconian military code governing the German army in 1944, but it had a chilling effect on morale and deepened the divide between ideological troops and pragmatic ones. Men already contemplating surrender now contemplated it in silence, afraid that speaking their thoughts would be their death sentence. The relationship between German soldiers and the Belgian civilian population, trapped in the cellars beneath their defensive positions, was complex, uncomfortable, and rarely discussed in official reports. International law required occupying forces to protect civilian lives. Practical military necessity demanded that defensive positions be established where they were most effective, regardless of civilian proximity. The result was an arrangement where German soldiers fought literally on top of families hiding in basements, with only floor joists and stone foundations separating machine gun positions from terrified children. Some German soldiers, particularly those with families of their own, went out of their way to ensure civilians had access to water and whatever food could be spared. Others, hardened by years on the Eastern Front, where civilian suffering was background noise to military operations, ignored the civilians entirely or treated them with contempt as obstacles to be managed. The civilians themselves were trapped between fear of the Germans above them and fear of the American artillery that might collapse the buildings on top of them. Belgian accounts, collected after liberation, describe the surreal experience of sheltering beneath firefights, hearing boots moving above, hearing German voices giving orders, hearing the screams of wounded Germans being dragged into adjacent cellars. The civilians were not combatants, but they were witnesses, and their presence added a dimension of moral complication to both sides' conduct of the battle. Communication with the outside world, specifically with German higher command, became increasingly sporadic as the battle progressed. Radio sets, always vulnerable to damage, failed one by one from shelling, from battery exhaustion, from the simple fact that equipment requires maintenance and maintenance requires resources that the pocket did not have. By September 10th, the German command at Rochefort was down to 2 functioning radio sets capable of reaching higher headquarters. These represented the pocket's only lifeline to the broader Wehrmacht command structure, the only means of receiving orders, the only way to communicate the garrison's deteriorating situation to anyone who might theoretically provide relief. The messages transmitted were increasingly desperate. On September 9th, the pocket commander radioed a request for permission to attempt breakout, arguing that his forces retained sufficient combat power to punch through American lines if authorized to abandon their positions. The response came 12 hours later. Hold current positions, reinforce from local resources, await further orders. This was, in effect, a death sentence dressed in bureaucratic language. There were no local resources. Reinforcement was impossible. The only thing to await was defeat. The psychological state of German soldiers in the pocket during these desperate hours varied widely based on temperament, experience, and role. Veteran troops, particularly those who had survived the Eastern Front's horrors, exhibited a fatalistic calm that unsettled younger soldiers. They had seen worse: Stalingrad, Kursk, the long retreat across Russia, and Rochefort was by comparison a minor tragedy. They would fight because fighting was their function. And when fighting became impossible, they would surrender or die, and either outcome was acceptable to men who had long since made peace with their own mortality. Younger troops, conscripts, and recent replacements oscillated between terror and numbness. Many had never expected to be in combat at all. They had been drafted in the expectation that Germany would negotiate a peace settlement before they ever saw action, and the reality of being trapped in a shrinking pocket with dwindling supplies shattered whatever illusions they had brought to the war. Officers attempted to maintain morale through routine and discipline, holding formations when possible, maintaining military courtesies, behaving as though the situation were merely difficult rather than hopeless. This theater of normalcy provided some psychological anchor for troops who might otherwise have dissolved into panic or despondence. The question of surrender, discussed obliquely, indirectly, always with awareness that such discussions could be construed as treasonous, became increasingly urgent after September 9th. German military culture, particularly as shaped by the Nazi regime, treated surrender as disgrace bordering on treason. Soldiers who surrendered faced potential court-martial. If subsequently liberated, their families faced social stigma and possible persecution. Their officers faced execution for failure to fight to the last. But these cultural and legal pressures were abstractions compared to the concrete reality of starvation, casualties, and ammunition exhaustion. The calculus was brutally simple: continue fighting and die almost certainly, or surrender and live possibly. Different units reached different conclusions. Wehrmacht units, particularly those with older officers who remembered a German army before Hitler, leaned toward pragmatism. Fight as long as militarily feasible. Then negotiate surrender under terms that preserved some dignity. SS units, indoctrinated in Nazi ideology and commanded by officers whose careers were bound to regime survival, insisted on fighting to the end. The friction between these perspectives would, in the next 72 hours, produce both mass surrenders and small unit last stands, sometimes within meters of each other. The pocket fragmenting not just militarily, but philosophically, as men made different choices about whether dying for a lost cause constituted duty or waste. By the evening of September 10th, the Rochefort pocket had become a compressed illustration of the German army's late war condition. Still dangerous, still professional in execution, but fundamentally broken in capability and morale. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Food was nearly exhausted. Medical supplies were exhausted. The defensive perimeter, once covering 15 kilometers, had contracted to barely 8 kilometers as strongpoints fell and survivors withdrew to inner positions. Casualties, killed and wounded, exceeded 2,000 men, with wounded now outnumbering the able-bodied in many sectors. The sounds within the pocket were changing, becoming less military and more elemental. Men coughing from smoke and dust and disease, men groaning in cellars where the wounded waited for help that would not arrive, horses screaming when hit by shrapnel, the creak and crash of buildings collapsing under American fire. The desperate hours were not a single moment, but a condition that deepened with each passing day. The pocket pressing in on itself, consuming itself, approaching the point where organized defense would become impossible, and the only choices remaining would be surrender, death, or some combination of the two. Inside the pocket, men understood this with absolute clarity. Outside the pocket, American commanders were beginning to sense it. The end was approaching. What remained was to determine its precise form and timing, and how many more men would be added to casualty lists before the arithmetic of siege reached its inevitable conclusion. September 7th, 1944. An American intelligence officer at 3rd Army headquarters studies a captured German paybook taken from a prisoner during the previous day's fighting. The paybook identifies its owner as belonging to the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich. The intelligence officer's blood pressure rises as he understands the implication. Das Reich is not some rear echelon security unit or hastily assembled Volkssturm formation. It is one of the Wehrmacht's premier combat formations, a unit with a reputation for both military effectiveness and war crimes. A division that has been at the sharp end of combat since 1940. If Das Reich elements are in the Rochefort pocket, this explains a great deal about why the American advance has been so difficult and so costly. The intelligence officer immediately drafts a report to be circulated to all units engaging the pocket. Enemy forces include Element 2nd SS Panzer Division. Anticipate fanatical resistance. Do not expect early surrender. The report will reach frontline units within 6 hours. The soldiers reading it will understand that the battle they thought they were fighting, reducing a demoralized remnant of defeated troops, is actually something more dangerous. A confrontation with an elite enemy that has no intention of making victory easy or cheap. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich carried a reputation that it preceded it like a shadow. Formed in 1939 from SS Verfügungstruppe, the division had fought across Poland, France, the Balkans, and most significantly on the Eastern Front, where it had earned a combat record of ruthless effectiveness tempered by documented atrocities against civilians and prisoners. By September 1944, Das Reich had been in continuous combat for most of 5 years. Its original cadre long since consumed by the meat grinder of the Eastern Front and replaced by successive waves of recruits who inherited the division's traditions and ethos. The approximately 800 Das Reich troops trapped in the Rochefort pocket represented a cross-section of this evolution, a core of hardened Eastern Front survivors, cadre who had seen Warsaw and Smolensk and Kursk, mixed with younger replacements who had been trained in the division's methods and indoctrinated in its ideology. They were not representative of German forces in general, they were the elite, or what remained of the elite after 5 years of catastrophic attrition. And they were about to make the Americans pay for every meter of ground in ways that exceeded even the stubborn resistance offered by regular Wehrmacht units. The tactical difference between SS and Wehrmacht troops was immediately observable to American units unlucky enough to face SS-defended positions. Wehrmacht soldiers, when pressed hard enough, would often withdraw to secondary positions, implementing the elastic defense that preserved forces for continued resistance. SS troops tended to hold in place until physically overrun, then fight room to room and hand to hand until killed or so badly wounded that further resistance was impossible. Wehrmacht troops, facing overwhelming odds, might send out surrender feelers, probing whether capitulation with honor was possible. SS troops viewed surrender as dishonor and death in combat as fulfillment of duty. These were not universal distinctions. There were Wehrmacht units that fought fanatically, and SS units that surrendered when the situation was hopeless. But they were tendencies significant enough that American commanders learned to identify SS-held sectors by casualty rates and duration of resistance. A strong point that should have fallen in 3 hours but was still fighting after 8 was almost certainly SS defended. An overnight withdrawal by German forces would leave Wehrmacht positions evacuated and SS positions still occupied. The psychological dimension was as significant as the tactical. Fighting SS troops was exhausting in ways that went beyond physical combat. Because the enemy's refusal to acknowledge reality created a kind of surreal persistence that ground down American morale, even as American firepower ground down SS combat strength. The ideology driving SS resistance was complex and, from a post-war perspective, deeply troubling. Waffen-SS troops were not merely soldiers, they were political soldiers, men who had taken personal oaths to Adolf Hitler and who had been indoctrinated in Nazi racial ideology alongside their military training. This ideological foundation made surrender psychologically difficult in ways that had little to do with military calculation. To surrender was not merely to acknowledge military defeat, it was to betray the oath, to fail the Führer, to dishonor the division's fallen comrades who had died believing in ultimate victory. Younger SS troops, particularly those who had joined after 1942, had known nothing but Nazi indoctrination their entire adult lives. The prospect of living in a post-Hitler world was literally unimaginable to them. not because they lacked imagination, but because every social and psychological structure they knew was built on Nazi foundations. For these men, dying in combat was not merely an acceptable outcome. It was potentially preferable to surviving into a world they had been taught was not worth living in. American troops struggling to reduce SS positions were not just fighting soldiers, they were fighting believers, and believers do not calculate costs the way rational actors do. The specific tactical capabilities of Das Reich, elements at Rochefort, manifested in small but significant ways that increased American casualties. SS units maintained better fire discipline than average Wehrmacht troops, waiting for targets to close before opening fire, maximizing the impact of each burst. SS soldiers were more likely to employ aggressive tactics, night infiltrations, counterattacks, ambushes, that kept Americans off balance even when the strategic situation was hopeless. SS-controlled strongpoints showed evidence of more sophisticated defensive preparation, with better fields of fire, more extensive obstacles, more systematic planning. Part of this was training. SS divisions received preferential allotment of experienced officers and NCOs. Part was esprit de corps, men who believed they were fighting for a cause larger than survival, fought with an intensity that cannot be trained. And part was desperation. SS troops knew that their reputation preceded them, that they were less likely to receive quarter if captured, that surrender might bring its own dangers. All of these factors combined to create defensive positions that were noticeably harder to reduce than those held by regular army units. American company commanders learned to request extra artillery support when attacking SS-held sectors, knowing that standard allocation of firepower would be insufficient. The documentation of war crimes committed by Das Reich, most notoriously the Oradour-sur-Glane massacre in June 1944, where the division murdered 642 French civilians, was known to American intelligence and created a complicated emotional context for the Rochefort fighting. American troops were aware they were facing a unit responsible for atrocities. This knowledge could cut two ways. It could harden American resolve, generating a determination to exact revenge by inflicting maximum casualties on SS troops. Or it could generate fear, a concern that SS troops who had murdered civilians would certainly not hesitate to kill American prisoners. The official American position was that enemy prisoners would be treated according to Geneva Convention, standards regardless of their unit or reputation. The actual practice was more variable. There is evidence, circumstantial but significant, that American troops were less likely to offer quarter to SS troops attempting to surrender, more likely to shoot first and ask questions later when confronted with SS insignia. Post-war investigations would document several incidents where SS prisoners were killed after capture, though the chaotic nature of urban combat made determining exact circumstances difficult. The moral mathematics were ugly, but perhaps inevitable. Units responsible for atrocities faced enemies less inclined to grant mercy, creating a vicious cycle where brutality justified brutality, and the laws of war became suggestions that both sides honored selectively. The presence of Das Reich in the pocket also affected German command dynamics in ways that complicated American efforts to induce surrender. SS officers, particularly those from ideologically committed divisions like Das Reich, carried significant influence within the German military hierarchy, despite sometimes holding relatively junior ranks. An SS captain could exercise moral authority over a Wehrmacht major simply through force of ideology and reputation. This meant that as surrender discussions began to percolate through the German command in the pocket, SS officers effectively held veto power. Wehrmacht commanders inclined toward negotiated capitulation had to navigate the objections of SS officers who viewed such capitulation as betrayal. In several documented instances, Wehrmacht officers planning to surrender their positions were prevented from doing so by SS threats, implicit or explicit, that such action would be met with immediate execution. The result was a kind of internal terrorism, where the hardest core believers enforced continued resistance on the broader population of German troops, many of whom recognized the futility of further fighting, but lacked the courage or power to act on that recognition. By September 10th, the Das Reich elements in Rochefort had been reduced to perhaps 300 combat-effective troops from the 800 who had entered the pocket. but those 300 remained disproportionately influential, forming a hard core of resistance that stiffened the defense even as material conditions deteriorated. American after-action reports from this period consistently note that the fiercest fighting occurred in sectors later identified as SS defended. The casualty exchange rate in these sectors was notably worse for Americans, where reduction of Wehrmacht positions might cost 2 to 3 American casualties per building. SS positions averaged 4 to 6 casualties. The difference was significant enough that some American commanders attempted to identify SS positions in advance and either bypass them, leaving them isolated for later reduction, or concentrate overwhelming force to minimize the duration of fighting. Neither approach was entirely satisfactory. Bypassing left dangerous positions in American rear areas. Concentrating force was limited by the supply constraints that afflicted all American operations at Rochefort. The SS presence transformed what might have been a straightforward siege into something more complex and costly, adding an ideological dimension to what should have been a purely military operation. The final paradox of the Das Reich presence at Rochefort was that their very effectiveness may have prolonged the battle in ways that ultimately increased total casualties on both sides. If the pocket had been defended only by regular Wehrmacht troops, it likely would have capitulated several days earlier, sparing hundreds of lives, American and German. But the SS Corps maintained resistance past the point where rational military calculation suggested surrender, forcing the Americans to continue grinding operations that killed men on both sides for objectives whose strategic value was questionable. In this sense, the SS troops were not merely fighting for the Third Reich. They were killing for it, inflicting casualties as a final service to a regime that was already defeated in all but the formal sense. The Americans, for their part, were forced to reciprocate, killing men who refused to accept reality, at cost to themselves and ultimately for no purpose beyond satisfying the tactical requirements of a battle that should never have lasted as long as it did. The Ghost Division, reduced to a shadow of its former strength, nevertheless cast a shadow over Rochefort that extended beyond its numbers, a shadow measured in the casualties lists and burial details and telegrams delivered to families who would never fully understand why their sons died fighting for a Belgian town they had never heard of, against an enemy who refused to surrender even when defeat was certain. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich would cease to exist as a coherent formation within 48 hours. But in the interval, it would kill as many Americans as it could manage, because that was what it had been trained to do, what it believed it existed to do, what ideology demanded it continue doing until the last man fell. September 11th, 1944. 0530 hours. In the pre-dawn darkness, 400 American artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously on a 600-meter frontage of German positions in southeastern Rochefort. The sound is not merely loud, it is overwhelming, a physical pressure that compresses the air and makes ears bleed and temporarily deafens men, even when they are covering their ears. For 15 minutes, the barrage continues at maximum rate of fire, approximately 400 rounds per minute, falling on an area smaller than 4 football fields. The mathematics are brutal, 1 shell per square meter every minute for a quarter hour. Nothing organic can survive this. Observers watching from American positions see the targeted sector disappear into a cloud of smoke, dust, and pulverized stone, the buildings literally disintegrating under the hammering. When the barrage lifts at 0545, the silence that follows is almost as oppressive as the noise that preceded it. Then American infantry and armor surge forward, expecting to find nothing but rubble and corpses. What they actually find, in some positions, are German soldiers emerging from basements and beginning to fire. The barrage has not destroyed the defense. It has merely suppressed it. But it has also announced that the Americans have lifted ammunition restrictions, that overwhelming force is now being applied without rationing, and that the end of the siege can be measured in hours rather than days. This is the breaking point. The moment when material superiority finally translates into tactical dominance, when German competence meets a wall of explosive that no amount of skill can deflect. The decision to commit maximum firepower to breaking the Rochefort defense represented a strategic shift that had been debated in American headquarters for days. The argument against was logistical. Expending ammunition at this rate would exhaust forward stocks and require days to replenish, potentially stalling offensive operations elsewhere. The argument for was operational. The siege had already lasted longer than anticipated, was tying down forces needed for other missions, and was generating casualties at an unsustainable rate. On September 10th, 3rd Army Headquarters made the calculation. Better to commit resources decisively and end Rochefort quickly than to continue incremental efforts that bled the army slowly. The ammunition was allocated, artillery units were given temporary carte blanche to fire at will, and the plan for the September 11th assault was built around the assumption that American firepower, finally unleashed without constraint, would shatter German resistance in a matter of hours. The reality proved more complex. German positions were more resilient than expected, defenders more stubborn, but the fundamental premise was sound. The breaking point had arrived because American logistics, having finally caught up to operational requirements, allowed the application of force so overwhelming that German defensive skill became irrelevant. The specific breakthrough occurred at Strongpoint 23, a former Belgian town hall that had anchored the southeastern corner of the German defense. This position had repulsed 3 American assaults over the previous week, each attack costing dozens of casualties and achieving nothing. The building itself was unremarkable: 3 stories, thick limestone walls, windows filled with sandbags and wreckage, but its position commanded the approach routes into Rochefort's center, making it impossible to bypass. On September 11th, following the massive artillery preparation, an American combined arms team assaulted the Strongpoint using every lesson learned in the previous week. Engineers moved forward under cover of smoke, placing satchel charges against the building's walls. Tank destroyers provided direct fire, systematically destroying the 2nd and 3rd floors with point-blank high-explosive rounds. Infantry worked through adjacent buildings, creating covered approach routes that avoided the Strongpoint's primary fields of fire. White phosphorus grenades were thrown through windows, forcing defenders to evacuate their positions or choke on smoke. The assault lasted from 0600 to 0915 hours, over 3 hours of continuous coordinated violence. When it ended, Strongpoint 23 was in American hands. The cost was 18 American casualties. The gain was a 300-meter penetration into the German defensive zone, the deepest advance since the siege began. The German command's reaction to this breakthrough revealed the fragility of the entire defensive system. The loss of Strongpoint 23 created a gap in the perimeter that could not be plugged with available reserves. Adjacent positions, their flanks now exposed, either had to be reinforced, requiring troops the Germans did not have, or abandoned. The German pocket commander made the only viable decision: order withdrawal from the entire southeastern sector, falling back to a new defensive line closer to Rochefort's center. This withdrawal, conducted under American observation and fire, became a nightmare. German troops attempting to move from one position to another were caught in open streets by American artillery and mortar fire. Small groups became separated from their units, wandered into American positions, and were forced to surrender. Equipment was abandoned, machine guns left in place because there was no time to move them. Ammunition crates scattered along withdrawal routes. Wounded soldiers who could not walk simply left in cellars with whatever medical supplies remained. The withdrawal, completed by noon on September 11th, successfully contracted the German perimeter and prevented American forces from exploiting through to the town center. But it cost the Germans perhaps 150 casualties and demonstrated that the defense had entered its terminal phase. Withdrawal is easier than attack, but it still requires organization, communication, and physical capacity. All 3 were degrading rapidly. September 12th brought confirmation that the German defense was no longer cohesive. American patrols probing into areas that had been strongly defended the previous day found positions abandoned, equipment left in place, buildings empty except for wounded who had been left behind because they could not be moved. This was not the elastic defense that had characterized earlier German withdrawals. Those had been calculated, orderly, with rear guards maintaining contact and covering forces ensuring that the withdrawal was not exploited. This was something closer to disintegration, the spontaneous dissolution of military organization under pressure. Some German units were still fighting, particularly SAS positions that had not received or had ignored withdrawal orders, but the overall defensive structure had fractured. American forces, advancing cautiously out of expectation of resistance, instead found themselves racing forward against little opposition, covering in hours what had taken days in the previous week. By noon on September 12th, American forces had reached Rochefort's Grande Place, the town center, though German-held positions still surrounded them, and firefights continued throughout the afternoon. The specific tactical moment that American commanders would later identify as the decisive breakthrough occurred at approximately 1300 hours on September 12th. A tank platoon, advancing down a street cleared by infantry, suddenly found itself facing the headquarters building, where the German pocket commander had established his command post. The meeting was unexpected. Neither side had anticipated contact at this location, and there was a moment of mutual surprise before the lead American tank fired a round directly into the building's ground floor. The effect was catastrophic for German command and control. The pocket commander was not killed. He was in the basement and survived the blast, but his communications equipment was destroyed, his staff was scattered, and the central node coordinating the defense ceased to function. From that moment, German positions were fighting independently, without orders, without coordination, each strong point making its own decisions about when to fight and when to surrender. Some positions continued fighting for another day. Others surrendered within hours. The destruction of the command post did not end the battle. Combat would continue sporadically until September 14th, but it ended the battle as a coordinated military operation. What remained was mopping up. The reduction of individual strongpoints, the acceptance of surrender from units that had lost all higher direction, the discovery of wounded in cellars and prisoners hiding in ruins. The casualty figures from September 11th and 12th reflected both the intensity of the breakthrough fighting and the chaos of the collapse. Americans suffered approximately 220 casualties over the two-day period, high in absolute terms, but actually lower than earlier phases of the siege when less ground was gained. The reduction in casualties per meter advanced indicated that tactical improvements and overwhelming firepower were finally achieving their intended effects. German casualties were harder to calculate precisely, approximately 300 killed or wounded, plus nearly 850 prisoners taken during this period. Many of the prisoners were wounded, captured when their positions were overrun. Others were simply men who had reached the limit of physical endurance and chose surrender over continued fighting. The prisoner flow, which had been a trickle throughout the siege, became a flood on September 12th, as German units concluded that continuing resistance served no purpose. The psychological dimension of the breaking point was as significant as the tactical. American troops, who had been attacking for a week against stubborn resistance, suddenly found that resistance crumbling. The change was disorienting. Soldiers accustomed to fighting for every building found buildings empty. Accustomed to taking casualties, found themselves advancing without being fired upon. The relief was palpable, but not unmixed. There was no clean line between the Germans are still fighting and the Germans have surrendered. Some buildings were empty while adjacent buildings still contained defenders. Some German soldiers walked out with hands raised while others fired until killed. The confusing patchwork of resistance and surrender created situations where American troops had to decide instant by instant whether to shoot or accept surrender, decisions complicated by fear, adrenaline, and the knowledge that mistakes could be fatal. German troops experienced their own disorientation as the command structure collapsed around them. Orders stopped arriving. Officers disappeared, killed, wounded, or simply unable to maintain contact with their units. Individual soldiers and small groups had to make autonomous decisions about whether to continue fighting, knowing that no one was coordinating their efforts and that their resistance would not prevent defeat, only delay it slightly. The civilian population, still trapped in cellars throughout Rochefort, began to understand that liberation was approaching when they heard the character of combat change. The steady, grinding exchanges of fire that had characterized the previous week gave way to sporadic firefights, interspersed with periods of relative quiet. American voices could be heard in the streets above, English, incomprehensible to most Belgians, but unmistakably foreign, unmistakably not German. Some civilians, the bravest or most desperate, emerged from their shelters to encounter American soldiers who were sometimes welcoming, sometimes suspicious. Always surprised to find civilians still alive in buildings that had been fought over for days. The Americans distributed what rations they could spare, directed civilians to collection points where they could receive aid, and continued pushing forward to reduce remaining German positions. The civilians' liberation was not a single moment, but a gradual transition, cellar by cellar, as American control expanded and German resistance contracted. By the evening of September 12th, the breaking point had passed, and the Rochefort pocket existed only in a geographical sense. American forces held most of the town. German forces were reduced to scattered strongpoints incapable of coordinated action. And the question was no longer whether the pocket would fall, but how long the final reduction would take. German ammunition was nearly exhausted. German troops were physically unable to continue fighting at any intensity. German command structure had disintegrated. The mathematical inevitability that had been theoretical on September 2nd had become concrete by September 12th. What remained was the human residue of a battle that should have ended days earlier. The process of accepting surrenders, the clearing of buildings to ensure no bypass German positions remained, the treatment of wounded on both sides, the counting of dead, the documentation of what had occurred. The breaking point had been reached through a combination of American tactical learning, material overwhelming force, and German exhaustion. None of these factors alone would have sufficed. Together, they created conditions where continued defense was physically impossible, and the siege entered its final, terminal phase. The Battle of Rochefort was ending. The aftermath was about to begin. September 12th, 1944. 1400 hours. An American armored cavalry squadron, positioned on the western edge of Rochefort throughout the siege, receives orders that transform their mission from containment to exploitation. For 10 days, they have maintained blocking positions, preventing German breakout attempts, engaging targets of opportunity, but essentially static. Now they are told to move, rapidly, aggressively, cutting deep into the pocket's rear areas before remaining German forces can reorganize. The squadron commander, a lieutenant colonel who has been chafing at the defensive mission, issues orders with visible enthusiasm. Bypass resistance, cut the roads, get into their rear, speed over security. We're not here to fight. We're here to trap whatever's left before it melts away. Within 30 minutes, 3 companies of light tanks and armored cars are racing eastward through gaps in the German defense, moving at speeds that would be reckless in training, and are borderline suicidal in combat. But the gamble is calculated. The German defense has fractured, and there is a narrow window to exploit that fracture before it stabilizes. The cavalry's mission is to ensure stabilization never occurs, to turn an organized withdrawal into a rout, to close the vise completely before trapped Germans can slip through gaps that still exist. This is exploitation warfare, the phase that follows breakthrough, and it requires a different mentality. Aggression over caution, speed over firepower, risks accepted because the potential payoff justifies them. The first 12 kilometers of the cavalry's advance proceeded with an ease that shocked even the optimistic. German positions that should have been occupied were empty. Roadblocks that should have delayed the advance had been abandoned. The squadron's lead elements, expecting to fight for every kilometer, instead found themselves racing through countryside, where the only Germans visible were walking toward American lines with hands raised. The collapse was so complete that the cavalry commander faced a logistical problem he had not anticipated: what to do with German prisoners when his mission was to keep moving. His solution was improvised and pragmatic: disarm prisoners, point them toward American infantry positions following behind, and continue advancing. By 1500 hours, the cavalry had covered 10 kilometers and was approaching the eastern edge of what had been the Rochefort pocket. The question was no longer whether American forces could close the vise, but whether anything remained inside worth trapping. The exploitation's effectiveness was measured not in ground gained, but in the psychological impact on remaining German forces. Units attempting to withdraw eastward, either in response to orders or through individual decision to escape before capture, suddenly found American armor in positions that should have been safe rear areas. The result was chaos compounded by panic. A German supply column moving east under the assumption that American forces were still contained in Rochefort proper drove directly into an American roadblock established by cavalry scouts. The column, 15 trucks, 4 horse-drawn wagons, approximately 100 soldiers, surrendered without firing a shot. Similar scenes repeated across the pocket's rear as German forces, their command structure shattered and their situational awareness non-existent, encountered American forces where no Americans should have been. The exploitation was achieving its purpose not through combat, but through presence. The mere fact of American forces being in the wrong places, wrong from the German perspective, destroying whatever organizational coherence remained. The coordination between exploitation forces and the main assault elements advancing from Rochefort required radio communication that worked remarkably well given the circumstances. American cavalry reported their positions every 30 minutes, allowing headquarters to track their progress and adjust the main assault to exploit opportunities created by the cavalry's deep penetration. When cavalry units reported a German defensive position at a road junction, artillery fire was called in from batteries that could range the target, destroying the position before it could seriously impede the exploitation. When cavalry units identified German forces attempting to establish a new defensive line, that information was passed to infantry units that could maneuver to trap those forces before they solidified their positions. The result was a level of operational integration that had been mostly absent in the siege's earlier phases, different American elements working in synchronized fashion toward a common objective, exploiting German confusion with coordinated actions that prevented the enemy from regaining any form of equilibrium. The human dimension of the exploitation revealed itself in the streams of German prisoners walking westward toward American lines. These men were not defeated in the dramatic sense of having been overrun in battle. They were defeated in the quieter, more complete sense of having reached the end of physical capacity to continue fighting. Many were wounded, hobbling on improvised crutches or supported by comrades. Most were simply exhausted, hunger, dehydration, sleep deprivation, and stress having reduced them to something barely recognizable as soldiers. American cavalry troopers, encountering these columns, reported emotions ranging from satisfaction to pity. The Germans were enemies, responsible for American casualties. But they were also obviously broken men who posed no threat and needed basic humanitarian assistance. American medics, operating beyond their authorized scope, treated German wounded when encountered. American soldiers shared rations with prisoners too weak to walk without eating. These small acts of mercy occurred alongside the exploitation's primary mission of destroying German combat power, creating a moral complexity that participants would remember decades later. The recognition that even in war, even between enemies, there are moments when shared humanity asserts itself. The most dramatic single engagement of the exploitation phase occurred at approximately 16:30 hours when an American cavalry platoon encountered a German rearguard position that had not received orders to withdraw and had no intention of surrendering. The position, a crossroads fortified with 2 anti-tank guns and a platoon of infantry, opened fire on American vehicles at a range of 800 meters. The lead American armored car was destroyed, killing its 3-man crew instantly. The cavalry platoon, trained for reconnaissance rather than direct combat, should have withdrawn and called for support. Instead, the platoon leader, a 22-year-old lieutenant making decisions faster than doctrine allowed, ordered his remaining vehicles to assault the position directly. The engagement lasted 15 minutes and cost the cavalry 2 more vehicles and 7 casualties. But it achieved its objective. The German position was overrun, the anti-tank guns were captured, and the road junction was secured. The lieutenant who ordered the assault received a Bronze Star for valor. He also received criticism from his squadron commander for taking unnecessary risks. Both reactions were valid. The exploitation required aggression, but aggression unconstrained by judgment becomes recklessness, and the line between them is visible only in retrospect. By nightfall on September 12th, American cavalry and infantry units had effectively closed the Rochefort pocket from all directions. The remaining German forces, estimated at perhaps 1,500 combat-effective troops plus 2,000 wounded, occupied an area of roughly 4 square kilometers in Rochefort's center and immediate surroundings. This represented a contraction of over 75% from the pocket's maximum size 10 days earlier, but size was less significant than the fact that the pocket now lacked any organized defensive perimeter. German forces were isolated in individual strongpoints rather than holding a continuous line, meaning American units could maneuver between positions, isolating and reducing each one individually. The exploitation had achieved its strategic objective. German forces that might have escaped or reorganized were trapped in positions from which neither escape nor effective resistance was possible. The vice had closed. What remained was to accept the surrender of forces that had no alternative, and to reduce the positions of those who chose to fight to the end. The air support component of the exploitation, while less visible than the ground operations, proved critical to preventing any German attempt to reorganize. American fighter bombers, finally able to operate in improved weather conditions, flew continuous patrols over the pocket's area on September 12th, engaging any German movement detected outside of buildings. Vehicles attempting to reposition were destroyed from the air. Troop concentrations were dispersed with strafing runs. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical damage. German soldiers learned that movement during daylight was suicide, that remaining under cover was the only way to survive. This restriction on movement made coordinated German action impossible and ensured that isolated strongpoints would remain isolated. The exploitation succeeded not just because American ground forces moved aggressively, but because American air power prevented any German response to that movement. The final assessment of the exploitation phase, conducted by 3rd Army Headquarters on the evening of September 12th, concluded that the rapid advance had shortened the battle by an estimated 3 to 4 days and had prevented several hundred German soldiers from escaping the pocket. The operation had cost 68 American casualties, a high price but significantly lower than the casualties that would have been suffered in 3 additional days of urban fighting. More significantly, the exploitation had transformed the American psychological position from attackers grinding against stubborn resistance to forces conducting mopping-up operations against a defeated enemy. This shift in perception mattered for both sides. American troops, sensing final victory, fought with renewed energy rather than the exhausted determination that had characterized earlier phases. German troops, recognizing that exploitation had cut off all escape routes, began surrendering in larger numbers as the futility of continued resistance became undeniable. The vice had not merely closed, it had crushed, and the exploitation ensured that nothing would escape from the wreckage. By September 13th, the question was no longer whether the pocket would fall, but whether it would fall through negotiated surrender or through the complete destruction of all remaining German positions. The answer would emerge over the next 48 hours, written in white flags and last stands, in pragmatism and ideology, in the choices that individual men and units made about whether honor required death or whether survival constituted its own form of victory. September the 13th, 1944. 0800 hours. A German colonel, 52 years old, career Wehrmacht officer who has served since before Hitler came to power, walks slowly toward American lines on the southern edge of Rochefort. He carries a white flag fashioned from a bedsheet. His uniform is filthy, torn at the knee, but his bearing remains military. Straight-backed, eyes forward, moving with deliberate dignity, despite the humiliation of his mission. Behind him, 200 meters back, his adjutant watches through binoculars, ready to run if the Americans shoot. They do not shoot. An American lieutenant approaches, rifle at the ready, and the German colonel renders a salute that the American, after a moment's hesitation, returns. The colonel speaks in heavily accented English. "I am authorized to discuss terms for the surrender of forces under my command. 237 men, 28 wounded. We request honorable treatment according to Geneva Convention." The American lieutenant, who is 23 years old and whose authority extends exactly as far as his 40-man platoon, responds with the only answer his orders allow. Unconditional surrender. All weapons to be laid down. all personnel to be assembled for transport to prisoner cages. No terms. The German colonel's face shows no emotion, but his shoulders sag infinitesimally. He nods once, turns, and walks back toward his lines. The negotiation has lasted 90 seconds. Behind German lines, in a cellar 300 meters away, an SS officer who has been watching through a rifle scope lowers his weapon and turns to his subordinate. The colonel would have betrayed us. We continue to fight. The dichotomy of Rochefort's final hours is established. Some will surrender with whatever dignity can be salvaged, and some will fight until fighting becomes physically impossible. The formal surrender process that unfolded over September 13th exposed the internal fractures within the German forces that had been developing throughout the siege. Wehrmacht units, particularly those commanded by career officers whose loyalty was to Germany rather than to the Nazi Party, moved towards surrender with varying degrees of speed, but general acceptance that continued resistance was pointless. These units sent out representatives, negotiated the mechanics of surrender, where weapons would be laid down, how wounded would be evacuated, what personal items soldiers could retain, and complied with American instructions. The process was orderly, almost bureaucratic, with German NCOs maintaining discipline and ensuring their men followed procedures. By noon on September 13th, approximately 2,400 German soldiers had surrendered from Wehrmacht units, moving in columns toward American-designated collection points where they were searched, documented, and prepared for transport to prisoner of war camps. The Americans, overwhelmed by the sudden flood of prisoners, improvised holding areas and struggled to provide even basic necessities, water, food, medical attention for wounded, to men who had been their enemies hours earlier and were now their responsibility. The SS unit's response to the surrender call was fundamentally different. SS officers who had maintained hardline positions throughout the siege did not soften their stance when defeat became undeniable. They hardened it. Orders were transmitted by the few remaining functioning radios and by runner that surrender was forbidden, that any SS soldier attempting to capitulate would be shot as a traitor. These were not idle threats. On the morning of September 13th, an SS lieutenant who attempted to lead his squad to American lines was executed by his company commander, shot in the back of the head as he walked toward the white flag. The remaining members of the squad, facing a choice between potential execution by Americans or certain execution by their own officers, chose to remain and fight. Similar incidents occurred at other SS positions, creating a climate of terror that enforced continued resistance even among men who recognized its futility. The SS strongpoints became islands of continued fighting in a sea of surrender, isolated positions where ideology trumped military reality and death was chosen over dishonor. The American response to this dichotomy required tactical flexibility and moral judgment that frontline officers had not been trained to exercise. Wehrmacht positions that displayed white flags were approached cautiously. Soldiers had been killed by false surrenders before, but generally processed without incident. SS positions that continued fighting were engaged with maximum available firepower, besieged until overwhelmed or starved into submission. But the boundary between these categories was not always clear. Some positions contained both Wehrmacht and SS troops, with Wehrmacht soldiers wanting to surrender, but unable to do so without triggering SS violence. Some SS soldiers, recognizing the futility, but unable to escape their officers' enforcement, fought with obvious reluctance, firing high or slow to avoid hitting Americans while maintaining enough activity to avoid being shot by their own superiors. American officers attempting to reduce casualties, their own and German, tried to communicate directly with surrounded positions, using German-speaking soldiers or prisoners to call for surrender. Sometimes this worked, triggering mutinies where Wehrmacht troops overpowered SS officers and capitulated. Sometimes it failed, triggering executions and reinforced resistance. The final day of fighting at Rochefort became a battle where psychological operations mattered as much as firepower, where the key objective was separating pragmatists from fanatics and allowing the former to surrender while destroying the latter. The largest single surrender event occurred at approximately 1,400 hours on September the 13th, when the Wehrmacht colonel, who had attempted morning negotiations, returned to American lines, this time accompanied by 460 soldiers who had collectively decided that their oath to follow orders ended when those orders became suicidal. The column of prisoners, wounded supported by comrades, men carrying makeshift white flags, officers maintaining formation even in defeat, stretched for nearly a quarter mile. American troops positioned to receive them experienced a range of emotions visible in post-battle accounts. Relief that these Germans at least would not have to be killed. Satisfaction that the enemy was finally acknowledging defeat. Unease at the sheer numbers. The prisoner column outnumbered the American company receiving them. And underneath everything, a kind of weary recognition that these German soldiers looked remarkably like themselves. Young men in dirty uniforms, exhausted and scared, wanting primarily to survive. The surrender was processed with minimal incident. Weapons were stacked in piles that would later require trucks to transport. Wounded were separated for medical treatment. The able-bodied were organized into groups for movement to rear area holding facilities. By 15:30 hours, the entire column had been processed, and the Wehrmacht presence in Rochefort had effectively ceased to exist as a military factor. The SS last stands, in contrast, extended into September 14th, and in some cases required American forces to literally destroy buildings to end resistance. Strongpoint 32, a fortified cellar complex beneath what had been a bank, held out until American engineers placed demolition charges that collapsed the structure, burying defenders under tons of rubble. When the wreckage was cleared 2 days later, 7 SS bodies were recovered, all killed by the collapse. Strongpoint 41, a 3-story residential building, was reduced by a tank destroyer firing 37 rounds of high explosive at point-blank range until the structure was no longer architecturally sound and collapsed on its own. 3 SS survivors emerged from the wreckage with hands raised. They were the only survivors from a garrison that had numbered 24 at the siege's start. The most protracted last stand occurred at the town church, where an SS company had fortified the stone structure and refused all surrender demands. American forces surrounded the church on September 13th and waited, hoping that hunger and ammunition exhaustion would force capitulation. On September 14th, having received no response to surrender demands, American artillery fired a sustained bombardment that partially destroyed the church roof and set the interior ablaze. SS troops began evacuating the burning building, and most were shot as they emerged. Whether by American fire or by their own officers attempting to prevent surrender, remains unclear from available records. By evening on September 14th, the church was silent, and a cautious American patrol found 42 bodies inside, most killed by the fire, some by gunshot wounds that appeared self-inflicted. The moral complexity of the last stands troubled American participants, and that trouble surfaces in after-action reports and personal accounts. The clearest position was that SS troops who fought to the end were legitimate military targets who had chosen their fate. But subsidiary questions complicated this clarity. What about SS soldiers who were essentially prisoners of their own officers, fighting not from conviction, but from fear of execution if they surrendered? What about wounded SS troops found in overrun positions? Were they combatants or casualties requiring medical treatment? What about the handful of very young SS soldiers, teenagers, some as young as 16, who had been conscripted late in the war and had known only Nazi indoctrination? American soldiers made these decisions in real time, under stress, with incomplete information. Most chose to treat all armed SS as hostile combatants until proven otherwise. Some made distinctions, accepting surrenders from those who clearly wanted out, while engaging those who continued fighting. There was no consistent policy, no unified approach. The last stands occurred in a moral gray zone where military necessity, individual judgment, and post-combat rationalization combined to produce outcomes that participants would question, defend, or regret for the rest of their lives. By the evening of September 14th, organized German resistance in Rochefort had ceased. The final count: 6,200 German prisoners taken, most in the last 48 hours of the siege, 1,847 German soldiers killed during the battle, over 2,100 wounded, most of whom survived to enter POW hospitals. The SS units that had enforced continued resistance were functionally destroyed, killed in last stands, captured when positions were overrun, or in a handful of cases having surrendered once their command structure collapsed. The Wehrmacht units had largely surrendered intact, their soldiers entering captivity with whatever dignity could be maintained in defeat. The contrast between these outcomes reflected the fundamental division within German forces between pragmatic military professionalism and ideological fanaticism, a division that had existed throughout the war, but that came into sharp relief at Rochefort, where the two approaches to defeat, acceptance versus denial, could be directly observed and compared. The final image of Rochefort on September 14th captures the battle's essential character: white flags flying from most buildings, indicating positions that had surrendered peacefully, alongside smoke rising from strongpoints that had been destroyed because their defenders refused to raise those flags. Surrender and last stands, occurring simultaneously in adjacent positions, sometimes in the same building. Pragmatism and fanaticism, existing side by side until American firepower resolved the distinction through force. The battle had ended not with a single climactic moment, but with a dispersed series of capitulations and destructions, each individual to the unit or position involved, the whole adding up to a victory that felt less like triumph than exhaustion. The Americans had won. No one disputed that outcome. But the price had been higher and the duration longer than anyone had predicted when the pocket formed on September 2nd. Victory at Rochefort was real, but not clean, complete, but not satisfying, achieved, but not celebrated. The white flags marked surrender. The last stands marked the cost. And together they marked the end of a battle that would be remembered by those who fought it, less for its strategic significance than for what it revealed about human nature when ideology confronts reality and men must choose between fighting and submitting, between dying for a cause and living in a world where that cause has failed. September 2nd, 1944. Early afternoon. Marie-Claire Dubois, 34 years old, mother of 3 children, stands in the kitchen of her family's apartment above their bakery in central Rochefort, listening to sounds that make her heart accelerate with fear. Explosions, distant but growing closer. The rumble of vehicles, tanks or trucks, impossible to tell. German soldiers running through the street below, shouting orders in a language she doesn't understand, but whose urgency requires no translation. Her husband, already in the cellar with their children, calls up the stairs. "Marie, come now. Bring what you can carry." She looks around the kitchen that has been her daily domain for 12 years of marriage, trying to decide what matters when your world is contracting to a stone cellar and an unknowable future. She fills a bag with bread, cheese, 2 bottles of preserved vegetables, a jug of water. She wraps her grandmother's silver crucifix in a cloth and puts it in her pocket. Then she descends the stairs into the cellar, pulling the heavy door closed behind her, and enters a darkness that will last 12 days. In that darkness, 41 people, her family, neighbors, strangers who sought shelter when the shelling began, will create a temporary society with its own rules, hierarchies, and moral boundaries. Some will emerge physically unharmed, but psychologically altered. Some will not emerge at all. This is the civilians' war, the battle beneath the battle, the story that military histories typically omit because it produces no tactical lessons and generates no glory. The physical conditions in Belgian cellars during the 12-day siege deteriorated from uncomfortable to nearly uninhabitable. The Dubois family cellar, typical of those throughout Rochefort, measured approximately 6 meters by 4 meters, enough space for perhaps 15 people in normal circumstances, but now occupied by 41. Bodies pressed together not from choice but from necessity. The air became thick, fetid, recycling through too many lungs too many times. The initial supplies, bread, cheese, preserved vegetables, whatever families had grabbed during their hurried descent, lasted perhaps 4 days. After that came hunger. Not the dramatic starvation of concentration camps, but the grinding daily insufficiency that weakens the body and clouds the mind. Children cried from hunger until they learned that crying brought no food, after which they became silent in ways that disturbed their parents more than the crying had. Adults rationed what remained, giving larger shares to children and elderly. But rationing only slows depletion. It does not prevent it. By September 9th, the Dubois cellar was subsisting on stored potatoes, water from the building's well, access through dangerous expeditions to ground level, and hope that liberation would arrive before starvation did. The sanitation situation created a crisis that tested the boundaries of human dignity. 41 people confined to a cellar for 12 days generate waste, human waste, and the cellar had no plumbing beyond a drain designed for rainwater runoff. In the first days, families established a corner for toilet use, screened by hanging blankets, with waste disposed of through the drain. But the drain backed up, whether from damage or from use it was never designed for, and by September 7th, the smell was overwhelming. Adults took turns emptying buckets through the cellar's small exterior ventilation shaft, a task that exposed them to potential German or American fire, but that had to be done regardless because the alternative, living in sewage, was psychologically impossible to accept. The loss of dignity, the reduction of human waste disposal to a daily crisis, affected morale as much as hunger. Marie Claire, keeping a diary that would later be donated to the Belgian War Museum, wrote on September 8th, "We are not living. We are surviving in a way that makes me ashamed, though I know we are doing nothing wrong. The smell is constant. The children ask why we cannot leave. I have no answer that makes sense to them or to me." Water access represented the most dangerous civilian activity during the siege. The wells in Rochefort were located at street level, requiring anyone drawing water to expose themselves to observation and fire from both German defenders and American attackers. A German officer, recognizing that his troops also needed water, established a twice-daily ceasefire, 30 minutes at dawn, 30 minutes at dusk, during which civilians and soldiers could access the wells without interference. This arrangement was communicated to American forces through intermediaries, and to the Americans' credit, they largely honored it. The water runs became communal rituals where civilian women, usually women, the men being judged too valuable to risk or too likely to be shot as partisans, would emerge from cellars, move quickly to the wells, fill whatever containers they had brought, and return to shelter. The experience was terrifying beyond what words easily convey. Exposure to open sky after days underground, ears straining for the sound of incoming artillery, eyes watching windows for snipers, hands shaking so badly that drawing water became difficult, and always the awareness that the ceasefire was voluntary, that either side could violate it, that survival depended on both armies choosing to recognize the humanity of unarmed women in a situation where humanity was optional. Most water runs proceeded without incident. 3 did not. On September 7th, a Belgian woman was killed by a stray round. Whether German or American was never determined while returning from the well. On September 10th, shelling resumed before all civilians had returned to cover, killing 1 and wounding 2. These deaths were not combat casualties in the military sense. They were civilian deaths in pursuit of survival, and they illustrated the fundamental helplessness of non-combatants caught between armies. The internal dynamics of cellar life revealed both the best and worst of human behavior under pressure. Leadership emerged organically. In the Dubois cellar, a retired schoolteacher named Monsieur Laurent assumed informal authority, organizing the rotation of tasks, mediating disputes, maintaining morale through his calm demeanor and refusal to panic. Hierarchies developed around usefulness, those who could contribute, drawing water, rationing food, treating minor injuries, gained respect and influence. Those who complained without contributing, or who attempted to take more than their fair share, faced social ostracism that was remarkably effective in a space where social cohesion was essential to survival. But pressure also created tensions. Arguments over food distribution became bitter, with accusations that children from some families received more than others. Romantic tensions developed, young adults in close quarters, facing possible death, seeking comfort from each other in ways that outraged older, more traditional residents. A fistfight on September 9th between 2 men competing for a young woman's attention was broken up only when Monsieur Laurent threatened to expel both from the cellar, a death sentence effectively. but a threat that worked because both men recognized that individual desires had to be subordinated to collective survival. The children's experience of the siege was distinct, and in some ways more damaging than the adults. Children lacked the context to understand war, to rationalize suffering, to maintain hope through abstract reasoning about future liberation. They understood only immediate reality: darkness, hunger, fear, the constant low-level terror of knowing that the adults who normally protected them were themselves terrified. Some children, particularly the younger ones, regressed, bedwetting, clinging to parents, refusing to sleep alone. Others matured with unsettling rapidity, becoming quiet and watchful, developing a seriousness incongruous with their age. The Dubois children, ages 9, 7, and 4, responded differently to the same circumstances, demonstrating that even siblings experiencing identical trauma process it through individual psychological lenses. The oldest, Jean, became protective of his younger siblings, rationing his own food to supplement theirs. The middle child, Sophie, withdrew into a silence that worried her parents more than complaints would have. The youngest, Etienne, seemed almost unaware of the danger, treating the cellar as an adventure, asking when they could go home in a tone suggesting he expected it would be soon. Post-liberation psychological assessments of Rochefort's children would reveal lasting impacts: nightmares, fear of enclosed spaces, difficulty trusting that tomorrow would be safe. The 12 days underground marked these children in ways that would surface across lifetimes. The relationship between civilians and German soldiers evolved over the siege in unexpected ways. In the first days, when German troops were fortifying buildings and establishing positions, contact was minimal and hostile, soldiers ordering civilians to remain in cellars, threatening consequences for disobedience, treating Belgian residents as obstacles rather than humans. But as the siege progressed and German circumstances deteriorated, the relationship became more complex. German soldiers, themselves suffering from hunger and fear, began making small gestures, sharing cigarettes with Belgian men, giving candy to children, in one documented case playing a harmonica in the street above a cellar, providing a moment of music in the midst of destruction. These gestures did not erase the reality that German forces had occupied Belgium, that German actions had created the situation that trapped civilians, that Germans were using civilian buildings as military positions in ways that violated international law. But they complicated the moral picture, adding shades of gray to what might otherwise have been a simple narrative of oppressor and victim. Some civilians responded with gratitude for small mercies. Others maintained hostility, regardless of individual Germans' behavior. Marie Claire's diary reflects this ambivalence. The young German who shared his water ration with Sophie yesterday may be the same one shooting at Americans today. I do not know how to think about this. He was kind to my daughter. He is also my enemy. Both are true. The moment of liberation, when it finally came on September 14th, was not the joyous celebration that liberations are supposed to be. American soldiers, searching buildings for remaining German positions, discovered cellars full of civilians who were malnourished, dehydrated, traumatized, and, in some cases, injured. The Americans distributed rations, K rations, not designed for civilians but the only food immediately available, and called for medics to treat the wounded. But the civilians' emergence into daylight revealed the cost of 12 days underground. Eyes accustomed to darkness struggled with sunlight. Legs that had barely moved for nearly 2 weeks could not walk without assistance. Minds that had focused entirely on survival could not immediately process that survival was now assured. Many civilians wept, though whether from relief or grief or simply emotional exhaustion was impossible to determine. Children clung to parents, afraid to be separated even momentarily. Adults stood in streets they had known their entire lives and stared at destruction that made the familiar unrecognizable. The Dubois family emerged to find their bakery gutted by fire. The upper floors collapsed, their life's work reduced to rubble. Marie Claire's reaction, recorded by an American journalist who happened to be present, was simple and devastating. "We are alive. That is more than I expected. The rest we can rebuild." But her eyes, the journalist noted, suggested she was not certain she believed this. The final toll on Rochefort's civilian population was 47 dead, 123 wounded, and 1,200 who survived physically but carried psychological scars that would never fully heal. The dead included those killed by artillery, by small arms fire, by building collapses, and in 3 cases by starvation-related illness among elderly residents too weak to survive on the available food. The wounded ranged from minor injuries to permanent disabilities, with medical care during the siege being essentially non-existent, and post-liberation care being improvised and overwhelmed. But the deepest wounds were not physical. Post-war studies of Rochefort survivors would document elevated rates of anxiety disorders, depression, and post-traumatic stress, concepts not well understood in 1944, but recognizable in hindsight through decades of follow-up. The children who survived would carry the siege into their own adulthoods, their life trajectories altered by 12 days in cellars. Some would refuse to enter basements for the rest of their lives. Some would develop food hoarding behaviors, unable to trust that supply was assured. Some would remember almost nothing, their minds having protected them through selective amnesia. The civilians of Rochefort paid no military price. They fired no shots, took no military objectives, appear in no after-action reports. But they paid a human price that military histories typically ignore, a price measured not in bodies but in years of disrupted lives, in trauma passed to children, in a community that would take decades to psychologically recover from 2 weeks of being caught between armies. Marie-Claire Dubois survived, raised her children, eventually rebuilt the bakery. But she never entered the cellar again. And on September 2nd of every year, until her death in 1978, she would spend the day alone, marking the anniversary of the day her world descended into darkness. The civilians' war at Rochefort had no victory, no defeat, only survival, and survivors who would spend the rest of their lives processing what survival had cost. September 15th, 1944. A field hospital 5 miles west of Rochefort. A sergeant sits on a cot, staring at his hands, turning them over slowly as if they belonged to someone else. His body shows no visible wounds, no bandages, no splints, no scars. But he has not spoken in 3 days, has not eaten without being hand-fed like a child, has not responded to questions or commands. The psychiatrist examining him, an army captain whose training in combat psychiatry consists of a 6-week course taken 2 years ago, writes in his evaluation, "Patient exhibits classic symptoms of acute combat exhaustion, complete withdrawal from external stimuli, inability to perform basic functions. Prognosis uncertain." The diagnosis is accurate as far as it goes, but it misses the essential truth. This sergeant is not exhausted. He is broken. Something fundamental in his psychological architecture has shattered under the accumulated weight of 12 days of urban combat, and whether it can be repaired or whether he will carry this brokenness for the rest of his life remains to be seen. He is one of 89 American soldiers evacuated from Rochefort for psychiatric rather than physical wounds. The number would be higher, but in September 1944, the military's understanding of combat trauma is primitive, and many men who should be evacuated instead remain with their units, functioning poorly, suffering silently, because no one recognizes that their wounds are as real as bullet holes. The medical terminology of 1944, combat exhaustion, battle fatigue, war neurosis, attempted to describe something that the culture had no adequate framework to understand. The concept of post-traumatic stress disorder would not be formally recognized until 1980, 36 years after Rochefort, but the condition existed regardless of whether it had a name. Soldiers returning from the Rochefort assault exhibited symptoms that should have been recognized as psychological injury. Nightmares so intense they woke screaming, flashbacks triggered by sounds resembling artillery, hypervigilance that made relaxation impossible, emotional numbness alternating with uncontrollable crying, survivors' guilt manifesting as self-destructive behavior. The Army's response was shaped by the era's understanding, or lack thereof, of mental health. Men exhibiting severe symptoms were evacuated to rest hospitals where treatment consisted primarily of food, sleep, and removal from combat for some period ranging from days to weeks. This helped some men recover enough to return to duty. It did nothing for underlying trauma, which remained untreated, unprocessed, and often unacknowledged. The correlation between duration of intense combat and psychiatric casualties was clear in the Rochefort data, though not understood at the time as revealing broader truths about human psychological limits. Soldiers who had been in combat for 8 or more consecutive days showed psychiatric casualty rates 3 times higher than those who had rotated out of the line periodically. The Rochefort siege, by keeping units in continuous contact for 12 days, created an environment almost perfectly designed to maximize psychological damage. The urban warfare component intensified this effect. The constant proximity to death, the inability to identify safe spaces, the grinding awareness that every building might contain an enemy and every street might conceal a sniper. Field commanders, seeing men begin to exhibit breakdown symptoms, had limited options. Rotating units out of the line was logistically difficult and would extend the battle's duration. Keeping traumatized soldiers in combat positions risked their lives and their comrades' lives. The solution, typically, was to redistribute men within their units, moving those showing severe symptoms to rear positions, supply, headquarters, support roles, while keeping them nominally with their units. This preserved unit integrity while removing men whose presence had become liabilities. But it also meant that traumatized soldiers received no treatment, only reassignment, and their trauma continued to worsen in the absence of care. The German prisoners exhibited their own patterns of psychological damage, different in some ways from American trauma, but equally severe. Wehrmacht soldiers, particularly those who had fought on the Eastern Front before Rochefort, showed high rates of what would now be recognized as complex PTSD, trauma layered on trauma, years of horror that had not been processed and now could not be because processing required psychological resources that simple survival had consumed. These men were often emotionally flat, exhibiting neither relief at having survived nor particular distress at captivity, simply existing in a state that suggested they had exhausted their capacity for emotional response. SS prisoners showed different patterns. Some exhibited the same flatness as Wehrmacht troops, but others maintained a kind of rigid defiance, clinging to Nazi ideology as the only psychological structure they had, unable or unwilling to accept that the framework that had given their lives meaning was collapsing. American interrogators noted that SS prisoners were significantly more difficult to work with than Wehrmacht prisoners, not because they possessed valuable intelligence, but because extracting any information required breaking through ideological armor that these men needed in order to maintain psychological integrity. The long-term trajectories of Rochefort veterans varied enormously, but showed patterns that later research on combat trauma would recognize as typical. Some men integrated their experiences, processed them, and moved forward into productive post-war lives, where Rochefort became a story they could tell without being consumed by it. Others suppressed their memories, refusing to discuss the battle, avoiding reunions, treating 12 days in Belgium as something that happened to someone else in a different lifetime. And some never recovered, their lives permanently altered by trauma that 1940s medicine could not treat and that they did not know how to manage. Veterans' hospitals in the 1950s and 60s filled with men whose alcoholism, unemployment, and relationship failures could be traced back to combat experiences they could not articulate and that society did not particularly want to hear about. The sergeant who sat on a cot on September 15th, staring at his hands, eventually recovered enough to be discharged. He returned to his home in Ohio, married, had children, worked as a mechanic, but his wife would later report that he never slept through a full night, that loud noises made him dive for cover, that he could not attend 4th of July celebrations because fireworks triggered panic attacks. He survived Rochefort physically. Psychologically, part of him remained in that field hospital cot, staring at hands that no longer felt like his own. The officers commanding units at Rochefort carried their own species of trauma, distinct from enlisted men's, but no less real. Company commanders who had led men into urban combat watched casualty lists that bore their signatures, men who had died following orders these officers gave. The moral weight of those deaths, necessary perhaps, but still deaths that resulted from decisions for which these officers were responsible, created a kind of existential burden that many never fully shed. One captain, writing to his family years later, described the experience. "I still see their faces. I remember their names. I ordered them forward, knowing some would not return, and they followed. What kind of man does that make me? What kind of man survives by sending others to die?" There was no therapeutic framework in 1944 to help officers process this burden, no recognition that command in combat creates its own psychological wounds. Many dealt with it by doubling down on military professionalism, treating their war service as a duty performed, and not thinking too deeply about its moral dimensions. Others carried guilt that manifested in various forms of self-punishment: career self-sabotage, relationship failures, substance abuse. The cultural narrative celebrated officers as heroes while ignoring that heroes also suffer, that leadership in war creates wounds that medals do not heal. The civilians of Rochefort exhibited trauma patterns that combined combat exposure with the additional burden of helplessness. Unlike soldiers, who at least had agency, could shoot back, could affect outcomes, could feel they were fighting rather than merely enduring, civilians had no control, no ability to influence their circumstances, no outlet for the terror of being trapped. Post-liberation assessments found elevated rates of anxiety and depression among Rochefort residents, particularly those who had spent the full siege in cellars. Children showed the highest rates of persistent symptoms, with many developing phobias, sleep disorders, and in some cases, physical symptoms, stomach ailments, unexplained pains, that represented somaticized psychological trauma. The Belgian government eventually established counseling services for Rochefort residents, but these were rudimentary, and most civilians simply coped as best they could with nightmares and fear responses they did not understand. The community itself showed collective symptoms: suspicion of strangers, resistance to anything that evoked the siege, difficulty celebrating the liberation because celebration felt obscene to people who had suffered so much. Rochefort would eventually recover, would rebuild, would resume something approximating normal life. But the recovery took decades, and some residents would argue that the town never fully healed, that a layer of darkness remained beneath the surface, the legacy of 12 days when ordinary civilians learned what it felt like to be powerless in a war they had not chosen. The medical establishment's understanding of combat trauma in 1944 was so limited that many genuine psychological casualties were misdiagnosed or dismissed entirely. Soldiers exhibiting trauma symptoms were sometimes labeled as cowards or malingerers, attempting to escape duty through faked illness. This was occasionally true. Some soldiers did attempt to feign illness to escape combat, but the assumption that psychological symptoms were typically fake did enormous damage to men suffering genuine trauma. Treatment protocols emphasized returning soldiers to duty as quickly as possible, minimizing the severity of symptoms, encouraging men to tough it out, and not dwell on their experiences. This approach, born from military necessity and cultural attitudes about masculinity, prevented healing and often worsened trauma. Men learned not to report symptoms because reporting led to stigma rather than treatment. They suffered in silence, and that silence prevented the accumulation of medical knowledge about trauma that might have helped future veterans. The cost of this ignorance would become clear decades later when Vietnam veterans, suffering similar symptoms, finally forced the medical establishment to recognize that combat trauma was real, was common, and required actual treatment rather than dismissal. By late September 1944, as survivors of Rochefort dispersed, American troops to other battles, German prisoners to POW camps, civilians to the work of rebuilding, the psychological legacy of the battle was already being written in symptoms that would persist for decades. 89 American soldiers were psychiatric evacuations from Rochefort, but this represented only the most severe cases. Hundreds more carried psychological injuries they never reported, never treated, never fully recovered from. German survivors entered captivity already traumatized, then faced years in POW camps that did nothing to heal their wounds and often compounded them. Belgian civilians returned to destroyed homes and tried to resume lives that would never fully escape the shadow of 12 days underground. The cost of victory at Rochefort, counted properly, was not merely 412 American dead and over 1,000 wounded, not merely 1,800 German dead and 6,000 prisoners, not merely 47 Belgian civilian deaths. The true cost included all those whose lives were permanently altered by trauma they would spend decades trying to understand, carried by survivors who received no treatment, no acknowledgement, no framework for making sense of what they had endured. The battle ended on September 14th. The aftermath would last lifetimes, written not in military histories but in nightmares, in broken relationships, in the quiet suffering of men and women who survived physically but who never fully escaped from those 12 days in September, when the world became a place of unrelenting horror and survival required sacrificing pieces of oneself that could never be recovered. September 14th, 1944. Adolf Hitler's headquarters, East Prussia. The Führer receives the daily briefing on military operations across all fronts: Italy, Eastern Front, Western Front. The officer delivering the Western Front portion mentions, almost in passing, that the Rochefort pocket has been eliminated, 6,000 prisoners taken, the siege concluded. Hitler's reaction is immediate and volcanic. Who authorized withdrawal? Who surrendered? I want names. His staff scrambles to explain that there was no authorized withdrawal, that the pocket collapsed under American assault, that surrender was inevitable given circumstances. Hitler is unmoved. Inevitable is a word for cowards. Men who believe in victory create victory. He orders that the commander of the Rochefort pocket be court-martialed if captured, that any surviving officers face investigation for defeatism, that the entire affair be treated as a failure of will rather than a tactical defeat. The meeting moves on to other sectors, other disasters. Rochefort receives no further discussion. It is a footnote, a minor defeat in a war that is producing defeats on a scale that makes a single pocket's elimination barely worth noting. But Hitler's reaction encapsulates why Rochefort mattered. It was a crystallized example of how his refusal to permit tactical flexibility was destroying the Wehrmacht unit by unit, pocket by pocket, defeat by defeat, that might have been avoided if professional military judgment had been allowed to override ideological rigidity. The strategic reckoning of Rochefort requires evaluating what the battle accomplished against what it cost. The objective accomplishment was clear. 18,000 German soldiers were removed from the war, killed, wounded, or captured in 12 days of fighting. This represented a significant degradation of German combat power in the West, particularly given that the trapped units included veteran formations like Das Reich, whose loss could not be easily replaced. The subjective cost was equally clear: 412 American dead, 1,206 wounded, 12 days of combat operations that delayed American advances elsewhere, substantial expenditure of ammunition and supplies, and psychological trauma to hundreds of men. The question that military historians would debate for decades was whether this exchange rate represented success or waste. Advocates for the operation's value argued that eliminating enemy forces is always valuable, that the German troops at Rochefort would have fought elsewhere, if not destroyed there, that the strategic gain justified the tactical cost. Critics argued that the pocket could have been contained with minimal forces while main American efforts bypassed it, that the 12-day siege was operationally unnecessary, that the same strategic result, removing German forces from combat, could have been achieved more efficiently by simply starving the pocket into surrender rather than assaulting it directly. The comparative analysis with other urban battles of World War II puts Rochefort's cost in stark perspective. The battle for Aachen, Germany, occurring simultaneously with Rochefort, cost Americans approximately 5,000 casualties to capture a city of comparable size defended by forces of comparable strength. Metz, besieged in November 1944, cost over 17,000 American casualties. By these standards, Rochefort's casualty count appears reasonable. The battle was prosecuted at a cost consistent with other urban warfare of the period. But this comparison also reveals the essential problem. Urban warfare in World War II was universally costly, producing casualty ratios far worse than open-field combat, suggesting that perhaps the entire strategic approach to reducing fortified cities needed reconsideration. American doctrine in 1944 emphasized aggressive assault, closing with the enemy, using firepower and maneuver to destroy opposing forces. This doctrine worked well in mobile warfare, but translated poorly to urban environments where defenders held every advantage. Rochefort became another data point, suggesting that doctrine needed evolution, but that evolution would be slow in coming. Too slow to help the men fighting in streets where every building was a fortress. The lessons learned process following Rochefort produced documentation that would be circulated throughout the European theater, and would influence American tactical development for the remainder of the war. Key findings included the necessity of engineer support for urban assault, the value of combined arms coordination, the importance of realistic pre-assault intelligence about enemy strength and capabilities, the need for specialized training in urban combat tactics, and the recognition that urban warfare generated disproportionately high psychiatric casualties, requiring planning for mental health support. These findings were incorporated into training programs and tactical manuals. Units preparing for urban assault in Germany received training that reflected Rochefort's lessons. Combat engineers were given higher priority and resource allocation. Efforts were made to improve pre-combat intelligence so that commanders did not attack blindly. Whether these improvements saved lives is impossible to quantify, but post-war analysis suggested that American casualties in urban combat did decline somewhat in the final months of the war, possibly reflecting the institutional learning that Rochefort contributed to. The German perspective on Rochefort, gleaned from post-war interrogations and memoirs, was remarkably consistent in identifying the battle as yet another example of Hitler's catastrophic interference in military operations. Professional German officers understood that the Rochefort pocket should never have existed, that the units trapped there should have been authorized to withdraw on September 3rd or 4th, when withdrawal was still feasible, rather than being ordered to hold in place until destroyed. The no-retreat order that created the pocket was tactically insane from a professional military standpoint, sacrificing valuable units for no strategic gain. But it was consistent with Hitler's broader philosophy that willpower could substitute for material reality, that refusal to retreat demonstrated fighting spirit, that every meter of ground lost was a personal betrayal of his leadership. The Wehrmacht by September 1944 was being systematically destroyed by a command structure where political ideology trumped military competence, where the dictator's fantasies about how war should work overrode battlefield reality about how war actually worked. Rochefort was one battle among hundreds in this larger tragedy, but it was a perfect illustration of the pattern. Competent troops, well led at the tactical level, destroyed because strategic leadership was divorced from reality. The alternative history question, what if German forces at Rochefort had been permitted to withdraw, is speculative but instructive. If the 66th Corps had retreated eastward on September 3rd, before the American encirclement was complete, the majority of its 18,000 men likely would have escaped. These men would have rejoined other German forces, requiring Americans to fight them elsewhere. From this perspective, trapping them at Rochefort and eliminating them as a combat factor represented a significant American operational success. But this analysis assumes that those German forces, if they had escaped, would have been combat effective elsewhere. Given the Wehrmacht's logistics crisis, its collapse in morale, its ongoing defeats across all fronts, it seems equally possible that these troops, if allowed to retreat, would have disintegrated through desertion and surrender within weeks. The alternative history cuts both ways. Perhaps Rochefort eliminated forces that would have fought effectively elsewhere, or perhaps it destroyed forces that were already defeated and simply needed time to recognize that fact. The counterfactual is unknowable, which means that assessments of Rochefort's strategic value depend heavily on assumptions about German resilience that cannot be tested. The operational impact of Rochefort on the broader Allied advance was minimal, but not zero. The 12 days spent reducing the pocket delayed American operations elsewhere by perhaps 3 to 5 days, the time required for forces committed at Rochefort to reorganize and redeploy. In the context of autumn 1944, when American advances were already being slowed by supply shortages and stiffening German resistance, this delay was relatively insignificant, but it contributed to the larger pattern where American operations proceeded more slowly than hoped. where the optimism of August that the war might end by Christmas evaporated in the face of tactical realities that proved more stubborn than strategic predictions suggested. Rochefort was not the cause of this slowdown, but it was part of the accumulated friction that ground down American momentum. Each battle that took longer than expected, each pocket that required days to reduce rather than hours, each position that cost more casualties than anticipated, these accumulated into an operational pace that made the rapid conclusion of the war impossible. By this measure, Rochefort mattered not for what it was, but for what it represented. The reality that defeating Germany, even a Germany clearly losing the war, would require grinding through resistance unit by unit, town by town, at a cost that would be substantial even in victory. The human dimension of the reckoning resists quantification, but demands acknowledgement. 412 American families received telegrams informing them that their sons or husbands had been killed in action near Rochefort, Belgium. Most of those families had never heard of Rochefort, could not locate it on a map, had no context for understanding why their loved ones died there. The strategic value of the battle, eliminating German combat power, contributing to the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany, was real but abstract. The loss was concrete, permanent, devastating. 1,800 German families received similar notifications, if they received notifications at all. The German system for informing families broke down late in the war. Belgian families mourned 47 dead, most of them civilians who had committed no crime beyond being in the wrong place when armies collided. The reckoning for these families was not strategic or operational, it was personal and absolute. Their losses were not justified or unjustified by strategic calculations. The losses simply were irreducible, permanent, a cost that would be carried forward into the peace that victory eventually produced. The final assessment of Rochefort's significance depends on what question is being asked. Did the battle contribute to Allied victory? Yes, marginally, by eliminating German forces and demonstrating continued American pressure across the front. Was the battle necessary? Debatable. Alternate approaches might have achieved similar results at lower cost. Was the battle well fought? Mixed. American forces showed tactical adaptability, but also made mistakes that increased casualties. Was the cost justified by the result? This is the hardest question, the one that admits no purely military answer. From a strategic perspective focused on defeating Nazi Germany as efficiently as possible, Rochefort's cost-benefit analysis looks reasonable. From a human perspective focused on the individual lives consumed by the battle, the cost looks enormous and the benefit abstract. Both perspectives are valid, neither is complete. The reckoning of Rochefort requires holding both truths simultaneously, that the battle was a necessary component of a just war against a monstrous regime, and that the specific men who died there paid a price that no strategic necessity can fully redeem. They died for victory, for their comrades, for duty. They also died because armies collided and someone had to be in the line of fire when that collision occurred. The reckoning honors their sacrifice while acknowledging that sacrifice, however honorable, is still loss, still tragedy, still a cost that those who ordered the battle did not personally pay. The Battle of Rochefort mattered because 18,000 German soldiers were removed from the war. It mattered because 412 American soldiers died. It mattered because 1,200 Belgian civilians survived 12 days underground. It mattered because battles matter, even small ones, even forgotten ones, even those that history will reduce to footnotes. And it mattered because the men who fought there, who bled there, who died there, mattered. Not as statistics in after-action reports, but as individuals whose lives had value independent of strategic calculations. That is the final reckoning. Rochefort was worth what it cost, only if we remember that what it cost was irreplaceable. September 20th, 1944. A makeshift office in what remains of Rochefort's town hall. 2 American officers, a major from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, and a captain from Army Intelligence, sit across from a Belgian civilian, a pharmacist named Henri Beaumont, who spent 12 days in his cellar and has now come forward with a story he believes constitutes a war crime. His hands shake as he describes what he witnessed on September 11th. 8 American soldiers, their hands clearly raised in surrender, being lined up against a wall by SS troops and executed. Beaumont watched from a cellar window, hidden but with clear line of sight. He can identify the building where it occurred, can describe the SS officer who gave the order, can provide details that only an eyewitness would know. The JAG major takes notes, asks clarifying questions, promises a full investigation. But privately, speaking to the intelligence captain afterward, he is less optimistic. If we investigate every alleged atrocity, we'll be here for years. And what will we find? German soldiers who committed crimes are already prisoners or dead. Justice is a luxury we can't afford when we're still fighting a war. The captain nods but says nothing. He is thinking of the 8 American soldiers, whoever they were, who followed the rules of war by surrendering and died because their enemy did not. He is thinking that if justice is a luxury, perhaps that tells us something uncomfortable about war itself. The investigation into potential war crimes at Rochefort began with good intentions and adequate resources, but quickly encountered the endemic problems that plague all efforts to establish accountability in combat. The first problem was evidence. Combat destroys evidence. Bodies are buried in mass graves or left in rubble. Witnesses are killed or dispersed. Documentation is minimal or non-existent. Buildings that contain crime scenes are damaged or destroyed. The passage of time between alleged crimes and investigation, even just days, allows memories to become confused, details to blur, certainty to erode. Investigators arriving in Rochefort 6 days after fighting ended found a town that had already begun the process of clearing debris, burying dead, removing the physical traces of battle. Reconstruction of specific incidents required piecing together fragmentary accounts from witnesses whose reliability was questionable at best. Belgian civilians had reasons to exaggerate German crimes. They had suffered, wanted justice, wanted their suffering acknowledged. German prisoners had reasons to minimize their actions. Admission meant prosecution, potentially execution. American soldiers had reasons to remain silent about anything they had witnessed that reflected poorly on their own side. The truth was somewhere in all these accounts, but extracting it proved nearly impossible. The specific incident Beaumont reported, the execution of 8 American POWs, was investigated thoroughly enough to establish that something happened, but not thoroughly enough to establish accountability. The building Beaumont identified showed evidence of executions, bullet holes at the height, consistent with standing prisoners being shot, blood stains, 8 sets of dog tags recovered from a hastily dug grave nearby. The dog tags confirmed that 8 American soldiers had died in or near that location, but establishing that they were executed after surrender rather than killed in combat required more than physical evidence. It required testimonial evidence from participants or observers. Beaumont's account was credible, but not corroborated. No other witnesses came forward. SS prisoners, when interrogated, denied knowledge of any executions or claimed prisoners had been shot while attempting to escape. Without corroboration, without German admission, without physical evidence that definitively proved execution rather than combat death, investigators could document that crimes likely occurred but could not build prosecutable cases. The 8 Americans were officially listed as killed in action. Their families never learned that they might have been murdered after surrender. Justice remained theoretical. The broader investigation into German conduct at Rochefort identified patterns of potential violations, but struggled with the question of what constituted a war crime in the context of urban warfare. German forces had fought from civilian buildings, placed military equipment near civilian shelters, used civilians as human shields, all violations of Geneva Conventions. But they had also, in many documented cases, allowed civilians access to water during ceasefires, had shared rations with starving Belgian families, had attempted to evacuate wounded civilians when possible. The picture was complex, systematic violations of the laws of war occurring alongside individual acts of humanitarian consideration. How to weight these against each other, how to determine whether violations were policy, prosecutable at command level, or individual actions by rogue soldiers. The investigators concluded that German forces at Rochefort had violated laws of war regarding civilian protection, but that these violations were consistent with broader Wehrmacht and SS practices throughout the war, and did not rise to the level of unique atrocity requiring special prosecution. This conclusion satisfied no one. Belgian civilians felt their suffering was being dismissed. American commanders felt German crimes were being minimized. But the legal reality was that Rochefort's violations, while real, were not exceptional, and prosecuting them would require prosecuting similar conduct across hundreds of battlefields, a task the military justice system was neither resourced nor inclined to undertake. The Allied conduct at Rochefort also came under scrutiny, though this investigation was far more limited and was conducted internally with minimal publicity. The specific question was whether American artillery bombardment of civilian areas, knowing civilians were present, constituted a war crime under the principle of proportionality, that military advantage must outweigh civilian harm. The legal analysis was complex. International law permitted attacks on military objectives even if civilians would be harmed as collateral damage, provided the harm was not excessive relative to military advantage. Rochefort presented a hard case. German military positions were integrated into civilian areas, making separation impossible. Americans had attempted to minimize civilian casualties through precision targeting, ceasefires for civilian evacuation, warnings when possible. But they had also conducted massive artillery bombardments knowing civilians were present, and 47 Belgian civilians had died. Was this excessive? The legal conclusion was that American conduct, while causing civilian deaths, did not violate laws of war because military necessity justified the action and reasonable precautions had been taken. This conclusion was legally defensible, but morally unsatisfying. The 47 dead civilians were still dead. Their families were not comforted by legal determinations that their deaths were proportional to military objectives. The post-war trials of German officers provided limited accountability for Rochefort-related crimes. Of the German officers captured during the battle, 2 were eventually prosecuted at war crimes trials, not specifically for actions at Rochefort, but for accumulated crimes across multiple campaigns. An SS captain was convicted of atrocities including execution of prisoners at multiple locations. Rochefort was mentioned in the charging documents but was not the primary basis for conviction. He was sentenced to death and executed in 1946. A Wehrmacht major was convicted of systematically violating civilian protection laws across Belgium and France. Again, Rochefort was part of the evidence, but not central to the case. He received a 20-year sentence, served 12 years, was released in 1958. For the families of the 8 executed Americans, for the Belgian civilians who had suffered, these convictions provided minimal satisfaction. The men who actually pulled triggers, who actually committed crimes at Rochefort, were mostly never identified, never charged, never held accountable. They disappeared into the general population of POWs, were eventually released, returned to civilian life, carrying secrets they never shared. Justice, such as it was partial, delayed, and incomplete. The question of American accountability for potential violations, summary executions of German prisoners, excessive force against civilian areas, individual acts of brutality, was handled almost entirely through military internal investigation, with few results made public. There is evidence, circumstantial but substantial, that American troops at Rochefort sometimes killed German prisoners attempting to surrender, particularly SS troops whose reputation preceded them. These killings were technically illegal under the laws of war, which required that prisoners who had surrendered be protected. But they occurred in the chaos of combat, were rarely witnessed by anyone in position to report them, and were rationalized by soldiers who believed, with some justification, that SS troops could not be trusted to surrender genuinely and might resume fighting if given opportunity. No American soldier was ever prosecuted for actions at Rochefort. Whether this reflected the absence of prosecutable crimes or the unwillingness of the military justice system to prosecute its own soldiers for actions committed under extreme stress is debatable. The practical reality was that victor's justice is an imperfect instrument. The winning side investigates the losing side thoroughly while investigating itself minimally, if at all. The moral philosophy underlying attempts to establish accountability for war crimes foundered on fundamental questions about what can reasonably be demanded of soldiers in combat. The laws of war assume that combatants can and should maintain moral discipline even under extreme stress, that they can distinguish legitimate military targets from civilians, can accept enemy surrender even when afraid, can exercise proportional force even when overwhelming force is available. These assumptions, while normatively correct, may be psychologically unrealistic. Soldiers at Rochefort operated under conditions that degraded moral reasoning. Sleep deprivation, fear, accumulated trauma, knowledge that mistakes could be fatal, anger at casualties suffered. Expecting perfect compliance with laws of war under these conditions may be unrealistic, but abandoning that expectation, accepting that war inevitably produces atrocities that cannot be prevented or punished, leads to moral nihilism that treats war crimes as inevitable rather than preventable. The investigation into Rochefort's aftermath struggled with this tension and never resolved it. Investigators concluded that crimes had occurred but that prosecuting them was impractical. This conclusion was honest about the limits of military justice, but dispiriting in its implication that accountability for war crimes is more aspirational than actual. The Belgian civilians' perspective on post-battle justice was shaped less by legal proceedings than by practical questions of compensation and recognition. Families whose homes had been destroyed wanted reimbursement. Families whose members had been killed wanted pensions. Everyone wanted acknowledgement that their suffering had been real and significant. The Belgian government, with Allied support, eventually established compensation schemes, but these were bureaucratic, slow, and inadequate. A destroyed bakery might receive compensation equal to 20% of replacement cost, paid over years. A widow might receive a pension equal to minimum subsistence, barely enough to survive. These compensations were better than nothing, but fell far short of making victims whole. More painful than the inadequate compensation was the speed with which the world moved on. By late 1944, Rochefort's battle was already fading from memory, overshadowed by larger battles in Germany, by the Ardennes offensive in December, by the inexorable march toward Berlin. The civilians who had suffered at Rochefort found themselves footnotes in a larger story, their trauma acknowledged briefly and then forgotten as attention moved elsewhere. Justice, for them, would have looked like sustained recognition of what they had endured. What they received instead was cursory acknowledgement and the implicit message that their suffering, while regrettable, was simply part of the larger catastrophe of war and merited no special attention. By 1945, as the war in Europe ended and attention turned to reconstruction, the question of accountability for Rochefort had largely been abandoned. 15 investigations had been opened into alleged war crimes. 3 had resulted in prosecutions. 2 had resulted in convictions. 13 had been closed without charges due to insufficient evidence, inability to identify perpetrators, or determination that actions did not constitute prosecutable offenses. The 8 executed American soldiers remained listed as killed in action, their actual fate unknown to their families. The 47 Belgian civilians remain statistics, their deaths recorded, but their stories largely untold. The German soldiers who had committed crimes, whether executing prisoners, abusing civilians, or violating laws of war, mostly escaped accountability, protected by chaos, by the sheer volume of similar cases across Europe, by the practical impossibility of achieving comprehensive justice in the aftermath of total war. The final reckoning on justice at Rochefort was this: accountability was attempted, justice was pursued, but the mechanisms available were inadequate to the task. The evidence was too fragmentary, the resources too limited, the will too exhausted. Some crimes were punished, most were not. The gap between what justice demanded and what justice achieved was substantial, uncomfortable, and ultimately unresolved. The Battle of Rochefort ended on September 14th, 1944. The battle for justice and accountability continued for years afterward and concluded without resolution, leaving behind the unsatisfying recognition that in the aftermath of war, perfect justice is impossible, and imperfect justice is all that can be achieved. Whether imperfect justice is better than no justice remained a question that participants and observers would debate for the rest of their lives, never reaching consensus, never finding answers that satisfied everyone, never escaping the uncomfortable truth that accountability for war crimes is aspirational more than actual, demanded by our moral frameworks but often denied by practical realities that our moral frameworks struggle to accommodate.